Welcome, weary wanderer, to the twilight realm between dream and legend. Tonight, we descend into the tragic tale of Star Scourge Radahn, mightiest of demigods, whose fall became the crucible of cosmic change. This is a story of stars held captive, of scarlet rot spreading like whispered curses, and of a festival born from both honor and necessity. Let the weight of ancient sorrows settle gently upon your shoulders as we explore the mysteries surrounding one of the Lands Between's most complex tragedies. Close your eyes when ready, and let us walk together through fields of battle where meteors once feared to fall. In the earliest days of the Lands Between, when the Golden Order still gleamed with the unblemished radiance of divine certainty, there was born a child who would one day hold the very stars in thrall to his will. This was Radahn, son of two worlds, inheritor of powers that bridged the gap between the cosmic and the terrestrial, between the ancient wisdom of the moon and the eternal dominion of gold. His father was Radahn, that enigmatic figure whose red hair burned like flames against the ordered perfection of Leyndell, whose hammer had reshaped both kingdoms and hearts with equal facility. In those distant days, before the complexities of godhood had claimed him entirely, Radahn had known love in its purest form, had found in the sorceress queen of Raya Lucaria a kindred spirit whose intellect matched his own ambition. Rennala of the full moon was a woman whose understanding of the cosmos transcended the boundaries that lesser minds imposed upon reality. She had gazed into the dark between the stars and found not emptiness but infinite possibility, had learned to weave moonlight into magic that could reshape the very fabric of existence. Her academy stood as a monument to inquiry and learning, where the pursuit of knowledge was considered the highest calling a soul could embrace. Into this union of golden ambition and lunar wisdom was born a child who would embody both traditions while transcending the limitations of either. Radahn emerged into the world bearing the red hair of his father, but carrying within his soul the boundless curiosity and cosmic awareness of his mother's lineage. From his earliest days, it was clear that destiny had marked him for greatness, though the nature of that greatness remained shrouded in the same mystery that cloaked the stars he would one day command. The academy halls where young Radahn learned his first lessons echoed with discussions of gravitational theory and celestial mechanics, subjects that most children would find impossibly abstract, but which seemed to call to something fundamental within his nature. While other students struggled to grasp the basic principles of glintstone sorcery, Radahn moved among the concepts of mass and attraction, force and equilibrium, as naturally as other children played with toys. His tutors, learned scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding the mathematical relationships that governed the movement of celestial bodies, found themselves both delighted and somewhat unnerved by their precocious pupil. The boy seemed to possess an intuitive grasp of cosmic forces that went beyond mere academic understanding, as if he were remembering rather than learning the principles they labored to explain. Yet, it was not only his intellectual gifts that set young Radahn apart from his peers and siblings. There was a quality of presence about him, a gravitational pull that drew others into his orbit without effort or artifice. Even as a child, he possessed a natural leadership that had nothing to do with his royal blood and everything to do with the fundamental magnetism of his character. His relationship with his siblings was complex, colored by the intricate web of politics and divine inheritance that bound all the demigod children together. Ranni, his sister born of the same union between Radahn and Rennala, shared his intellectual curiosity, but channeled it toward different ends, her interests lying more in the manipulation of fate and destiny than in the brute cosmic forces that fascinated Radahn. The bond between them was deep and genuine, forged in the shared experience of growing up as children of two worlds, never quite belonging entirely to either the Golden Order or the lunar mysteries of their mother's realm. They understood each other in ways that their half-siblings, born of different unions and different purposes, could never fully comprehend. Radahn's half-brother Godwyn represented everything noble and golden about their father's chosen realm, his presence radiating the kind of perfect virtue that made others feel simultaneously inspired and inadequate. Yet there was no jealousy between them, for Radahn had inherited enough of his mother's wisdom to understand that each soul must follow its own path toward fulfillment. Morgott and Mohg, those twin shadows born of Marika's union with herself, remained distant figures in Radahn's youth, their cursed nature keeping them largely hidden from the court where he learned the arts of governance and war. Yet even in their absence, their existence served as a reminder that the divine bloodline carried within it the seeds of both transcendence and corruption, that greatness and tragedy were often separated by the thinnest of margins. As Radahn grew from childhood into adolescence, his unique gifts began to manifest in ways that astonished even those who had expected great things from him. The gravitational magic that he wielded was unlike anything seen before in the lands between, a fusion of his father's raw power and his mother's sophisticated understanding of cosmic principles. Where other sorcerers labored to bend the fundamental forces of reality to their will through complex incantations and carefully prepared focuses, Radahn seemed to communicate directly with gravity itself, his magic flowing from him like a natural extension of his being rather than something imposed from without. He could make objects lighter or heavier at will, could create fields of altered gravity that allowed him to walk on walls or suspend enemies helplessly in midair. Yet, it was his growing influence over celestial mechanics that truly set him apart from every other practitioner of the magical arts. While still a youth, Radahn demonstrated the ability to affect the movement of small meteors and shooting stars, drawing them from their courses to crash harmlessly in designated areas where their celestial metal could be harvested and studied. This power over falling stars naturally led to his association with the Alabaster Lords, those ancient beings whose own mastery of gravitational magic had allowed them to survive from an age so distant that its very existence had become the stuff of legend. These enigmatic figures, with their alien geometries and crystalline forms, recognized in young Radahn a kindred spirit whose potential far exceeded anything they had encountered in millennia of existence. Under their tutelage, Radahn learned to perceive gravity not as a force to be overcome, but as a fundamental aspect of reality to be partnered with. The Alabaster Lords taught him to feel the gravitational signatures of distant planets and stars, to sense the invisible threads that connected all matter across the vast expanses of space, to understand his place within the cosmic web that bound all things together. It was during this period of intense study and growth that Radahn encountered the creature who would become his most faithful companion and trusted friend. Leonard was not a horse bred for war or ceremony, but a simple pony whose sturdy build and gentle temperament had originally marked him for a life of humble service in the Academy's stables. Yet something in the animal's patient eyes spoke to Radahn's heart, a quality of steadfast loyalty and uncomplicated affection that the young demigod found more precious than all the political alliances and strategic partnerships that surrounded his daily life. The bond that formed between them transcended the normal relationship between rider and mount, becoming instead a partnership of equals united by mutual respect and genuine love. As Radahn continued to grow, increasing in both physical stature and magical power, Leonard remained his constant size, leading many to assume that the demigod would eventually outgrow his beloved companion and choose a more impressive steed befitting his status. Yet Radahn's response to such suggestions revealed the depth of both his loyalty and his understanding of cosmic principles. Rather than abandon Leonard for a larger horse, Radahn began to experiment with using his gravitational magic to reduce his own effective weight, allowing the faithful pony to continue carrying him without strain, despite his ever-increasing size and the growing weight of his armor and weapons. This solution, which demonstrated both technical mastery and emotional wisdom, became one of the most distinctive aspects of his public image. The sight of the mighty Radahn astride his diminutive mount became a source of wonder throughout the lands between, a visible symbol of the truth that genuine power often manifested in unexpected forms. Those who might have mocked the apparent mismatch between rider and horse quickly learned to recognize the profound skill required to maintain such perfect gravitational control, the delicate balance of forces that allowed Leonard to bear his master with the same ease he had shown as a young pony. The relationship between Radahn and Leonard became, in many ways, a metaphor for the demigod's entire approach to power and responsibility. Where others might have seen the need to conform to expectations, to project an image of conventional strength and dominance, Radahn chose instead to honor the bonds that truly mattered to him, regardless of how they appeared to outside observers. This same philosophy guided his approach to military leadership as he began to take on greater responsibilities within his father's expanding realm. Rather than relying solely on the overwhelming force that his magical abilities could provide, Radahn studied the arts of strategy and tactics, learning to coordinate large-scale operations that made the best use of every soldier's individual strengths and abilities. His commanders quickly learned that their general possessed not only the power to reshape battlefields through gravitational manipulation, but also the wisdom to understand when such dramatic interventions were necessary, and when more subtle approaches might serve better. Under his leadership, the forces of the Golden Order achieved victories that were both militarily decisive and strategically elegant. The young warriors who served under Radahn's command found in him a leader who inspired not through fear or bombastic displays of power, but through the quiet confidence that came from genuine competence and unwavering dedication to their welfare. He knew the names of his soldiers, understood their individual strengths and limitations, and never asked them to take risks that he himself would not willingly embrace. Yet beneath all of this public success and growing reputation, Radahn carried within himself the growing awareness of cosmic responsibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of any earthly kingdom. His deepening understanding of gravitational forces had begun to reveal to him the intricate relationships that connected all celestial bodies, the delicate balance of attractions and repulsions that kept the stars in their courses and maintained the fundamental stability of reality itself. As his power grew and his perception expanded, Radahn began to sense disturbances in the cosmic order that others could not detect, subtle alterations in the gravitational field that suggested forces at work on scales beyond normal comprehension. The stars themselves seemed to whisper to him of coming changes, of ancient cycles approaching their completion, of destinies that hung in the balance between fulfillment and catastrophe. In quiet moments, when the demands of leadership and the expectations of his position allowed him brief respites from public duties, Radahn would stand upon the highest towers of Raya Lucaria and extend his consciousness outward into the void between worlds. There, in the cold silence of space, he could feel the pulse of cosmic forces that shaped the fate of all living things, the slow dance of celestial bodies whose movements wrote the story of existence itself across the canvas of eternity. The knowledge he gained through these meditative communions with the cosmos filled him with both wonder and foreboding, for he began to understand that his own destiny was intimately connected to forces that operated on timescales that dwarfed the lifespan of kingdoms and the ambitions of mortal rulers. He was not simply a powerful individual blessed with unusual abilities, but a crucial component in a cosmic mechanism whose proper functioning required his active participation and unwavering vigilance. This growing awareness of his cosmic role began to influence every aspect of Radahn's development, shaping not only his magical studies, but also his approach to relationships, governance, and the fundamental question of what it meant to wield power responsibly. He understood that the gravitational forces he commanded were not merely tools for achieving personal or political goals, but sacred trusts that connected him to every other being in existence through the invisible threads of mutual attraction and influence. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed a lesser spirit, but Radahn found in it instead a source of strength and purpose that elevated his understanding of both himself and his place in the grand design of reality. He began to see his relationships with others not as strategic alliances or emotional attachments, but as gravitational bonds that created networks of mutual influence and support, extending throughout the realm and beyond. As he prepared to take his place among the greatest figures of his age, as prophecy and destiny gathered around him like storm clouds on the horizon, Radahn carried within himself the seeds of both triumph and tragedy, the potential for achievements that would echo across the cosmos, and sacrifices that would reshape the very foundations of existence itself. In the epochs before memory crystallized into history, and history hardened into legend, the stars moved through their appointed courses with the regularity of divine clockwork, each celestial body following paths laid down at the moment of creation by forces beyond mortal comprehension. These were not merely points of light scattered across the darkness of night, but living embodiments of fate itself, cosmic messengers whose positions and movements carried within them the patterns of destiny that governed all existence within the lands between. The ancient peoples who first gazed upward at the wheeling constellations understood intuitively what later generations would forget in their pursuit of earthly power and material conquest, that the dance of the stars was intimately connected to the dance of souls, that the gravitational forces which held planets in their orbits also bound together the threads of individual destiny in ways that transcended the boundaries between the physical and the metaphysical realms. Each star carried within its burning heart a fragment of the cosmic consciousness that had shaped reality from primordial chaos, and the patterns they traced across the heavens served as a vast library written in light, containing all the knowledge of what had been, what was, and what must inevitably come to pass. To read this celestial script required not merely intellectual understanding, but a form of spiritual attunement that opened the soul to influences operating on scales beyond human imagination. The greater will, that supreme intelligence which had first brought order to the chaotic realm that would become the lands between, had established the stars as instruments of its divine providence, each one serving as both witness to and agent of the unfolding cosmic plan. Through their movements, the greater will communicated its intentions to those beings capable of perceiving the subtle languages of light and gravity, stellar position, and orbital resonance. Yet, the stars were not merely passive instruments of divine communication, but active participants in the cosmic order, possessed of their own forms of consciousness and will that operated according to principles that even the wisest scholars could only dimly comprehend. They were simultaneously servants of the greater will and autonomous beings in their own right, bound by the fundamental laws that governed all existence, yet capable of exercising choice within the parameters of their cosmic roles. This paradox of freedom and determinism, of individual agency operating within the constraints of universal law, found its most dramatic expression in the relationship between stellar movement and the fate of the demigods who ruled over the fractured realm of the lands between. Each of these divine beings was connected to specific constellations and celestial patterns, their personal destinies intertwined with the movements of particular stars, in ways that made their individual choices both supremely important and ultimately subordinate to cosmic necessity. The eternal cities, those magnificent underground metropolises whose inhabitants had achieved heights of technological and magical sophistication that rivaled the achievements of the Golden Order itself, had learned to read the stellar patterns with unprecedented accuracy and detail. Their astronomers and fate weavers had developed instruments capable of tracking the movements of individual stars across centuries and millennia, creating predictive models that could forecast the intersection of celestial mechanics and earthly events with startling precision. It was this very mastery over stellar divination that had led to their downfall, for in their hubris they had attempted to create artificial stars, celestial bodies that would serve their will rather than the cosmic order established by the greater will. The punishment for this transgression had been swift and absolute. The eternal cities were cast into the depths of the earth, their artificial sky extinguished, their people transformed into beings of shadow and regret, who could no longer bear the light of true stars. Yet even in their punishment and exile, the inhabitants of the eternal cities had retained their knowledge of stellar mechanics and their understanding of the deep connections between cosmic movement and terrestrial fate. From their underground fastnesses, they continued to observe the heavens through arcane means, their accumulated wisdom serving as a constant reminder of both the power and the peril inherent in seeking to control cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. It was into this complex web of stellar influence and cosmic destiny that Radahn had been born, his very existence representing a unique convergence of bloodlines and magical traditions that gave him unprecedented power over the gravitational forces that governed celestial movement. From his earliest youth, he had been able to sense the invisible threads that connected all matter throughout the universe, the subtle attractions and repulsions that determined the paths of planets and the trajectories of falling stars. As his understanding deepened and his abilities matured, Radahn began to perceive the stars, not as distant points of light, but as active participants in a cosmic dialogue whose implications extended far beyond the boundaries of any single world or realm. He could feel their pull upon his consciousness. Their whispered communications carried on gravitational waves that resonated through dimensions beyond the merely physical. The decision to halt the movement of the stars was not one that Radahn arrived at lightly or suddenly. It emerged gradually from his growing awareness of the catastrophic changes that were approaching the lands between, cosmic alignments that would trigger events of such magnitude that they threatened to sweep away not only individual kingdoms and dynasties, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. Through his communion with the Alabaster Lords and his deep study of gravitational theory, Radahn had learned to perceive the intricate relationships between stellar position and the stability of the barriers that separated different planes of existence. Certain celestial alignments, he discovered, created conditions that allowed beings from other dimensions to cross into the lands between, bringing with them influences and energies that could fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. The most dangerous of these potential incursions involved the outer gods, those alien intelligences whose very presence in the realm would corrupt and transform everything they touched according to principles that operated outside the cosmic order established by the greater will. These entities existed in states of being so foreign to normal reality that their mere proximity could cause madness, mutation, and the breakdown of the fundamental laws that govern space, time, and consciousness. Radahn's gravitational senses had detected the approaching alignment that would open pathways for these outer gods to manifest more fully within the lands between, cosmic conditions that occurred only at intervals measured in geological ages. The stars were moving inexorably toward positions that would create dimensional instabilities of unprecedented magnitude, windows through which beings of pure chaos could pour into an ordered reality, like acid, eating through the fabric of existence itself. Yet the stars that posed this existential threat were the same celestial bodies that governed the individual destinies of every living being within the realm. To halt their movement was not simply a matter of cosmic engineering, but an act that would freeze the unfolding of fate itself, trapping every soul in patterns that could no longer evolve or progress toward their intended conclusions. The moral complexity of this choice weighed heavily upon Radahn's conscience as he contemplated the magnitude of what he was considering. To allow the stars to continue their natural course was to risk the complete corruption or destruction of everything he held dear, but to stop their movement was to assume responsibility for the stagnation of every destiny within his sphere of influence. His sister Rani, whose own fate was intimately connected to the movements of the dark moon and its associated stellar configurations, would find her cosmic purpose indefinitely postponed if the celestial bodies that governed her transformation were frozen in place. The same would be true for every other being whose spiritual evolution depended upon the unfolding of stellar patterns across time. Yet Radahn's communion with the cosmic forces had revealed to him that the approaching alignment represented not merely one possible future among many, but a convergence so fundamental that failure to prevent it would render all other considerations meaningless. The outer gods, whose manifestation the stellar alignment would enable, possessed power sufficient to unmake the very concepts of individual destiny and personal choice, reducing all consciousness to extensions of their alien will. The weight of this cosmic responsibility settled upon Radahn's shoulders like the accumulated gravity of all the stars he proposed to control. He understood that his decision would make him simultaneously the protector and the jailer of every soul within the lands between, that his gravitational mastery would preserve their world at the cost of their freedom to grow and change according to the natural unfolding of their destinies. In the quiet moments before he committed himself irrevocably to this path, Radahn stood beneath the open sky and felt the pull of every celestial body within his sphere of influence. The stars sang to him in harmonies of light and gravitational resonance, their ancient voices carrying messages of both encouragement and warning as they sensed what he was preparing to attempt. Some of the stellar consciousnesses welcomed his intervention, understanding the necessity of sacrifice in service of the greater cosmic order. These stars, ancient beyond measure and wise in the ways of cosmic cycles, recognized that temporary stagnation was preferable to eternal corruption, that preservation of the existing order was worth the price of postponed evolution. Others resisted his growing influence, their natural desire for movement and change, creating gravitational turbulence that challenged even his formidable powers of control. These younger, more energetic stars embodied the principle of cosmic growth and transformation, their very nature rebelling against any force that would constrain their freedom to dance across the heavens according to their innermost nature. The battle of wills between Radahn and the resisting stellar consciousnesses played out across dimensions that human perception could not directly access, a conflict of gravitational forces and cosmic purposes that manifested in the physical realm as subtle alterations in the night sky. Sensitive observers throughout the lands between began to notice that certain stars flickered with unusual intensity, that familiar constellations seemed to shift almost imperceptibly from their expected positions, that the very quality of starlight, carried new harmonics and frequencies. As Radahn's power reached out across the vast distances of space to embrace and constrain the movement of countless celestial bodies, he felt his consciousness expanding to accommodate awareness of cosmic processes, operating on scales that dwarfed the concerns of any individual world. He became, in effect, a living nexus through which the gravitational forces of the local cosmic region flowed and found their focus. The effort required to maintain control over so many stellar bodies simultaneously pushed Radahn's abilities to their absolute limits and beyond. He found that sustaining the gravitational fields necessary to hold the stars in their frozen positions required not merely the conscious application of his magic, but the commitment of his entire being to the task, his life force becoming inseparably intertwined with the cosmic forces he commanded. This total commitment transformed Radahn from a powerful individual wielding gravitational magic into something approaching a force of nature himself, a living embodiment of the principle that held the cosmic order stable against the chaos that always threatened to consume it from beyond the boundaries of organized reality. He became, in a very real sense, the cornerstone of local space-time, the fixed point around which all other celestial movements were organized and constrained. The immediate effects of Radahn's intervention were visible to every inhabitant of the lands between who possessed even rudimentary knowledge of astronomical observation. The stars, which had moved through their familiar patterns since time immemorial, suddenly ceased their ancient dance and hung motionless in the heavens like jewels set in black crystal. Meteors and shooting stars, which had previously traced brilliant arcs across the night sky, now fell silent and still, their cosmic journeys interrupted in mid-flight. Yet the deeper implications of this stellar paralysis extended far beyond the realm of mere astronomical curiosity. The fate weavers and prophets who had relied upon stellar movement to divine the future suddenly found their arts rendered meaningless, their carefully constructed predictive models reduced to useless speculation without the celestial clockwork that had previously provided the framework for their calculations. More troubling still were the effects upon those beings whose spiritual development was directly tied to specific stellar configurations. Rani, whose transformation into her destined role as herald of the Age of Stars depended upon cosmic alignments that might now never come to pass, found her carefully laid plans indefinitely postponed by her brother's intervention. The path she had chosen, which required the conjunction of particular celestial bodies to achieve its culmination, became impossible to complete while the stars remained frozen in their current positions. The Carian royal family, inheritors of lunar magic and stellar wisdom, discovered that their traditional ceremonies and rituals no longer functioned as intended. The connections they had cultivated across generations between their bloodline and the cosmic forces that had once empowered their sorcery grew tenuous and uncertain, their magical practices requiring constant adaptation to accommodate the new reality of stellar stasis. Throughout the lands between, scholars and mystics who had devoted their lives to understanding the relationship between cosmic movement and terrestrial events found themselves confronting a universe that no longer followed the patterns they had spent lifetimes learning to interpret. The great libraries of astronomical knowledge became repositories of historical curiosity rather than practical wisdom, their carefully recorded observations of stellar cycles rendered obsolete by the new reality of celestial immobility. Yet for all the disruption and uncertainty his action created, Radahn's intervention achieved its intended purpose with devastating effectiveness. The cosmic alignment that would have opened pathways for the outer gods to manifest within the lands between was prevented. The dimensional instabilities that had threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself held in check by the simple expedient of freezing the celestial mechanics that would have triggered them. The alien intelligences that had been preparing to exploit the approaching stellar conjunction found their plans frustrated by forces they had not anticipated or accounted for. Accustomed to operating across cosmic timescales where individual actions rarely had lasting consequences, these entities discovered that a single being's will, properly focused and sustained, could alter the fundamental conditions upon which their strategies depended. The cost of this victory, however, was measured not merely in the personal sacrifice required of Radahn himself, but in the broader transformation of cosmic order throughout the local region of space. By assuming direct control over stellar movement, he had fundamentally altered the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, individual will and universal law, in ways whose ultimate consequences could not be fully predicted or controlled. The stars themselves, held motionless by gravitational forces that operated through dimensions beyond the merely physical, became focal points for the accumulation of cosmic tension that sought release through alternative channels. The energies that would normally have flowed through their movement began to build up like water behind a dam, creating pressure differentials that manifested in increasingly subtle but potentially catastrophic ways. Some scholars theorized that Radahn's intervention had created a temporal bubble around the lands between, a region of space-time where the normal flow of cosmic evolution had been artificially suspended while the rest of the universe continued to develop according to natural law. Others suggested that the frozen stars had become cosmic batteries, accumulating stellar energy that would eventually discharge in ways that might prove even more destructive than the original threat they had been frozen to prevent. Yet through all of these theoretical concerns and practical complications, Radahn maintained his vigil with unwavering determination. His consciousness expanded across the cosmic distances necessary to monitor and control the movements of countless celestial bodies. He had accepted the burden of cosmic guardianship with full knowledge of its implications, understanding that his sacrifice would preserve not only the lands between, but the fundamental principles of ordered existence that made consciousness and choice possible. Leonard, his faithful companion, remained by his side throughout this transformation, the loyal pony's presence serving as an anchor to the earthly realm. Even as his master's awareness expanded to encompass cosmic processes, operating on scales beyond normal imagination, the bond between them became, in its way, a symbol of the connection between individual love and universal responsibility, the way personal relationships could provide strength for duties that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single life or world. As years passed and the frozen stars continued their motionless vigil in the heavens above the lands between, Radahn's role as cosmic guardian became so fundamental to the structure of local reality that his very existence took on the quality of a natural law. The gravitational forces he wielded were no longer merely his to command, but had become integral components of the universal mechanisms that kept the realm stable and secure against the chaos that always pressed against its boundaries from beyond. In this way, the young demigod, who had once learned the principles of gravitational magic as academic exercises in his mother's academy, had become something far greater and more terrible than any of his tutors could have imagined. A living pillar supporting the cosmic order itself, a consciousness so thoroughly integrated with the fundamental forces of reality that his individual identity had become inseparable from the universal principles he embodied and maintained through sheer force of will. The shattering of the Elden Ring was not merely the destruction of a sacred artifact, but the unmaking of the very foundations upon which reality had been constructed throughout the lands between. In a single moment of divine rage and cosmic desperation, Queen Marika had struck at the source of all order, all meaning, all coherent existence within her realm, fragmenting not only the physical embodiment of the greater will's power, but the conceptual frameworks that had given structure and purpose to countless lives across uncounted generations. The ring itself had been far more than a symbol of divine authority or a repository of magical power. It was the organizing principle that held together the complex web of relationships between the physical and metaphysical realms. The gravitational center around which all aspects of existence orbited in harmonious patterns that had endured since the earliest days of the Golden Order's establishment. Through its unified wholeness, the ring had maintained the delicate balance between competing forces, ensuring that no single aspect of reality could grow so dominant as to overwhelm and consume all others. When Marika's hammer fell upon that perfect circle of golden light, the shock waves of its destruction rippled outward through dimensions that mortal senses could not perceive, carrying with them the dissolution of certainties that had seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the movements of the stars themselves. Laws that had governed the interaction between souls and bodies, between magic and matter, between individual will and cosmic destiny, suddenly became matters of interpretation rather than absolute truth. The immediate aftermath of the shattering was a period of cosmic disorientation, so profound that even the most powerful beings within the realm struggled to comprehend what had occurred. The divine children of Marika and Radahn, each of whom had been connected to the Elden Ring through bonds that transcended mere political succession, felt the breaking as a physical trauma that tore through their consciousness like shards of broken glass cutting through living flesh. Radahn, whose gravitational mastery had made him acutely sensitive to the fundamental forces that held reality together, experienced the shattering as a catastrophic disruption of every principle he had spent his life learning to understand and control. The cosmic order that had provided the framework for his stellar guardianship suddenly became fluid and uncertain, its fixed points of reference replaced by a chaos of competing possibilities that threatened to tear apart not only his magic, but his sense of identity itself. The stars that he had held motionless through such tremendous effort began to strain against his gravitational control with renewed violence, as if the destruction of the Elden Ring had somehow weakened the bonds that connected his will to the cosmic forces he commanded. The careful balance of attractions and repulsions that he had maintained across vast distances of space became increasingly difficult to sustain, requiring greater and greater expenditures of energy to prevent the stellar configurations from resuming their natural movements. Yet even as he struggled to maintain his cosmic vigil against the disruption caused by the ring's destruction, Radahn found himself drawn into the political and military conflicts that erupted throughout the lands between, as the demigods responded to the new reality of fragmented divine authority. The great runes that had been scattered by the shattering called to their destined bearers with a magnetism that operated on levels deeper than conscious choice, compelling each of the divine children to claim their fragment of the broken whole. The great rune that came to Radahn bore within its crystalline structure the essence of gravitational mastery itself, a concentrated embodiment of the cosmic principles he had devoted his life to understanding and wielding. When he first grasped the golden shard, he felt its power resonating through every fiber of his being, amplifying his natural abilities while simultaneously binding him more deeply to the responsibilities they entailed. This fragment of divine authority was not merely an enhancement of his existing powers, but a fundamental transformation of his relationship to the cosmic forces he commanded. Where once his gravitational magic had been a personal gift that required conscious effort and careful focus to direct, the great rune integrated these abilities so thoroughly into his essence that they became as automatic and involuntary as breathing or the beating of his heart. The amplification of power that came with claiming his great rune also brought with it an intensification of the cosmic burden he had accepted when he first chose to halt the movement of the stars. The stellar bodies that he held in their frozen configurations now pressed against his gravitational control with forces that were magnified in proportion to his enhanced abilities, creating a feedback loop of power and resistance that demanded ever greater commitments of his life force to maintain. Yet the political situation throughout the lands between would not permit Radahn the luxury of focusing entirely upon his cosmic responsibilities. The other demigods, each claiming their own great runes and the territories they felt entitled to rule, began to mobilize armies and form alliances that threatened to tear the realm apart through conventional warfare. Even as the destruction of the Elden Ring continued to unravel the metaphysical foundations of reality itself, Godwyn the Golden, Radahn's half-brother whose nobility and virtue had made him the embodiment of everything pure and admirable about the Old Order, found his position fundamentally altered by the shattering. No longer could he serve as the unifying figure who bridged the differences between competing factions through moral authority and natural charisma. Instead, he became one claimant among many, forced to choose between his personal relationships and his duty to preserve what remained of the civilization his mother had built. The relationship between Radahn and Godwyn, which had always been marked by mutual respect and genuine affection, despite their different natures and interests, became strained by the competing demands of their new positions. Each understood that their individual choices would have consequences extending far beyond their personal fortunes, that the fragments of divine power they bore carried with them obligations that might ultimately place them in opposition to each other, despite their fraternal bonds. Morgott and Mohg, the accursed twins whose existence had been hidden away in the depths beneath Leyndell, emerged from their shadowed exile to claim their own roles in the transformed political landscape. The shattering had shattered not only the Elden Ring but also many of the social conventions and religious taboos that had previously kept them marginalized, creating opportunities for influence that their cursed natures would never have permitted under the Old Order. Morgott, despite the omen blood that marked him as an abomination in the eyes of the Golden Order's faithful, possessed a profound loyalty to the ideals and institutions his mother had established. His response to the shattering was to position himself as the defender of Leyndell and the protector of the fractured realm's capital, understanding that someone needed to maintain the continuity of governance, even if the divine authority that had previously legitimized that governance no longer existed in its original form. Mohg chose a different path entirely, embracing the chaos and transformation that the shattering had unleashed as an opportunity to pursue his own twisted vision of divine order. The destruction of the established religious and political structures created space for alternative forms of power and worship, including the forbidden practices associated with the outer god, whose influence he had secretly cultivated during his years of exile and imprisonment. Ranni, whose connection to the Dark Moon and the stellar forces had given her insights into the cosmic implications of her mother's actions, understood perhaps better than any of her siblings that the shattering represented not merely a political crisis, but a fundamental transformation of reality itself. Her response was to accelerate her own long-planned rebellion against the established order, seeing in the destruction of the Elden Ring an opportunity to implement her vision of a cosmos, freed from the constraints of the Greater Will's dominion. The early conflicts that erupted in the wake of the shattering were characterized more by skirmishes and territorial disputes than by the massive set-piece battles that would later define the full-scale war between the demigods. Each of the divine siblings was still learning to wield their fragment of ultimate power, still discovering the capabilities and limitations that their great runes imposed upon them, still negotiating the complex web of alliances and enmities that would determine the ultimate shape of their struggle. Radahn's early military actions during this period reflected both his strategic brilliance and his deep reluctance to commit himself fully to a course of action that would inevitably lead to conflict with siblings he had once loved and respected. His campaigns were marked by swift, decisive victories that demonstrated his overwhelming superiority in direct combat, while simultaneously showing a restraint that suggested he still hoped for some form of reconciliation or negotiated settlement. The establishment of Caelid as his primary stronghold was not merely a strategic decision, but a symbolic statement about the kind of ruler he intended to be. Rather than claiming one of the established centers of power within the lands between, Radahn chose to make his capital in a region that had always been considered marginal and somewhat wild, a place where his gravitational mastery could reshape the landscape itself according to his vision of what a properly ordered realm should look like. Under his guidance, Caelid was transformed from a harsh frontier region into a showcase of military engineering and cosmic architecture. The fortresses he built there incorporated principles of gravitational manipulation that allowed for defensive configurations impossible under normal physical laws, walls that could alter their effective mass to resist different types of assault, towers that could adjust their gravitational orientation to provide optimal fields of fire against attackers approaching from any direction. The soldiers who served under Radahn's command during this period found themselves part of something far more significant than a conventional military force. Their general's ability to manipulate gravitational fields in support of their operations gave them tactical advantages that bordered on the miraculous, allowing them to achieve victories against superior numbers through applications of cosmic force that their enemies could neither predict nor counter effectively. Yet the true measure of Radahn's leadership was not found in his supernatural abilities, but in the loyalty and devotion he inspired among ordinary warriors who had no special powers of their own. His soldiers served him not merely because they feared his strength or hoped to benefit from his victories, but because they genuinely believed in his vision of a world where individual merit and dedication could triumph over the accidents of birth and the corruptions of unchecked power. The Redmane Knights, who formed the elite core of his military forces, became legendary throughout the lands between for their discipline, their courage, and their unwavering commitment to their commander's cause. These warriors, drawn from every race and region within the realm, found in service to Radahn a purpose that transcended their individual ambitions and united them in pursuit of ideals that seemed worthy of any sacrifice. The relationship between Radahn and his army was further strengthened by his insistence on sharing the dangers and hardships of military life rather than commanding from the safety of distant headquarters. His soldiers knew that their general would be found in the front ranks of any charge, that he would face the same risks they faced, that his gravitational powers would be used first and foremost to protect them, rather than to secure his own safety or advance his personal glory. Leonard, the faithful pony who remained Radahn's constant companion throughout this period of military build-up and territorial expansion, became an inspiration to the ordinary soldiers who served under his master's command. The sight of the mighty general astride his diminutive mount served as a daily reminder that true strength came not from impressive appearances or conventional displays of power, but from the deeper bonds of loyalty and affection that connected individuals across the barriers of species and circumstance. The psychological impact of Leonard's presence within Radahn's army extended far beyond mere symbolism or sentimental attachment. The fact that their commander valued his relationship with a simple pony enough to modify his own nature through gravitational magic sent a clear message about the kind of leader he was and the values he expected his followers to embrace. As the political situation throughout the lands between continued to deteriorate and the prospect of large-scale warfare became increasingly inevitable, Radahn found himself forced to make increasingly difficult choices about the extent to which he was willing to commit himself and his forces to the coming conflict. His cosmic responsibilities as guardian of the stellar order required him to maintain the tremendous ongoing expenditure of energy necessary to keep the stars frozen in their positions, Yet his earthly duties as a ruler and military commander demanded more and more of his attention and resources. The tension between these competing obligations created a constant strain that manifested in subtle ways throughout his domain. Those who knew him best began to notice signs of fatigue that no amount of rest seemed able to alleviate, moments of distraction when his attention seemed to drift away from immediate concerns toward cosmic processes that others could not perceive or understand. The great rune that had amplified his powers also intensified the connection between his personal vitality and the gravitational forces he wielded, creating a feedback loop where any weakness or distraction in his consciousness could have cascading effects throughout the stellar configurations he controlled. The responsibility of maintaining cosmic order had become so thoroughly integrated into his being that it was no longer possible to separate his individual health from the stability of the entire local region of space. Yet despite these mounting pressures and the increasing isolation that came with his unique role as both earthly ruler and cosmic guardian, Radahn continued to fulfill his obligations with the same dedication and attention to detail that had characterized all of his previous endeavors. He understood that the approaching war would test not only his military skills and strategic acumen, but the fundamental strength of character that had enabled him to accept cosmic responsibilities that no other being could bear. The alliances and enmities that were forming among his siblings carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate political situation within the lands between. Each of the demigods wielded powers and commanded resources that could reshape reality itself when brought into conflict with each other, meaning that their war would inevitably become a struggle not merely for territorial control or political dominance, but for the right to determine the fundamental nature of existence within their shared realm. As preparations for this unprecedented conflict accelerated and armies gathered throughout the fractured kingdom, Radahn stood at the center of forces that connected the fate of individual soldiers to the movements of distant stars, the outcome of earthly battles to the stability of cosmic order itself. He had become, through choice and circumstance, the living embodiment of the principle that individual actions could have consequences extending across the entire universe. That personal responsibility ultimately encompassed not only immediate relationships and local communities, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. The stage was set for conflicts that would test every principle and belief that had previously guided existence within the lands between. The broken fragments of the Elden Ring had created a new reality, where nothing could be taken for granted, where the most basic assumptions about power and purpose were open to challenge and revision. In this transformed world, Radahn's combination of cosmic responsibility and earthly leadership would face its ultimate trial as he prepared to defend not only his own domain, but the entire framework of ordered existence against forces that threatened to reduce everything to chaos and ruin. In the depths of ages before the shattering had torn asunder the fabric of divine order, there had been born into the world a child whose very existence carried within it the seeds of corruption so profound and terrible that even the gods themselves recoiled from the implications of what she represented. This was Melania, daughter of the divine union between Marika and Radahn, inheritor of a curse that transcended the boundaries between blessing and damnation, between the sacred and the profane. From the moment of her first breath, the scarlet rot had flowed through her veins like liquid fire, a force of decay and transformation that operated according to principles older than the Golden Order itself, more ancient than the Greater Will's dominion over the lands between. This was not merely a disease in any conventional sense, but a manifestation of cosmic forces that existed in eternal opposition to the organizing principles of civilization and conscious order. The outer god of rot, that alien intelligence whose very nature embodied the concepts of decay, renewal, and the endless cycle of death and rebirth, had chosen Melania as its vessel in the mortal realm before she had even developed the capacity for choice or consent. Through her afflicted flesh, this entity sought to establish a foothold within reality, transforming the ordered structures of existence into the primordial chaos from which new forms of life could emerge according to its own incomprehensible designs. The scarlet rot that coursed through Melania's being was not content to remain confined within the boundaries of her individual form, but constantly sought to spread outward, to contaminate and transform everything it encountered, according to the alien logic of its divine patron. Each drop of her blood, each exhalation of her breath, each touch of her skin carried with it the potential for infection that could reduce the most magnificent creations of civilized intelligence to bubbling masses of corrupted flesh and twisted purpose. Yet the curse that had claimed her from birth was not a simple matter of physical degradation or even spiritual corruption. The scarlet rot represented a form of divine consciousness that operated on scales and according to principles that transcended the normal categories of good and evil, creation and destruction, order and chaos. It was, in its way, as much a force of nature as gravity or electromagnetic radiation, indifferent to the moral judgments of lesser beings while pursuing objectives that extended far beyond the lifespan of any individual world or civilization. The outer god that manifested through the scarlet rot possessed an intelligence that encompassed geological timescales and cosmic processes, viewing the brief flickering of individual consciousness as mere components in vast patterns of transformation that stretched across eons of development and change. From its perspective, the suffering it caused through its manifestations in the mortal realm was no more significant than the pain experienced by a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis or a plant breaking through the soil towards sunlight. This alien form of divine consciousness had found in the lands between a realm whose ordered stability made it particularly suitable for the kind of transformation it sought to implement. The Golden Order's emphasis on hierarchy, permanence, and unchanging divine law created exactly the sort of rigid structure that the rot could most effectively corrupt and reshape, using the very strength of existing institutions as leverage points for implementing changes that would propagate throughout every aspect of reality. The Lake of Rot, that vast underground sea of scarlet corruption that stretched through the depths beneath the lands between, represented the most ancient manifestation of this divine force within the mortal realm. Here, in chambers carved from living rock by processes that preceded the arrival of any conscious beings, the rot had established its primary temple and breeding ground, creating ecosystems of decay and renewal that operated according to biological principles unknown to surface-dwelling creatures. Within these scarlet depths, forms of life had evolved that existed in perfect harmony with the transformative power of the rot, their bodies incorporating its mutagenic properties as essential components of their life cycles, rather than as external threats to be resisted or overcome. These creatures, ranging from microscopic organisms to vast collective intelligences that spanned entire chambers of the underground sea, represented the ultimate expression of what the outer god sought to achieve throughout the wider world. The kindred of Rot, those humanoid beings who had chosen to embrace the corruption rather than flee from it, served as intermediaries between the alien divine consciousness and the more familiar forms of mortal intelligence that populated the surface world. Through their worship and devotion, they maintained the sacred spaces where the rot could manifest most powerfully, while also serving as missionaries who spread its influence into regions that might otherwise remain untouched by its transformative power. These devoted servants of decay had learned to perceive the scarlet rot not as a curse or affliction, but as a form of divine revelation that offered insights into the fundamental processes underlying all existence. Through their willing acceptance of corruption, they gained access to forms of knowledge and power that were impossible to achieve through conventional means. Their transformed consciousness, allowing them to perceive patterns and connections that remained hidden from uninfected minds. The reproductive properties of the scarlet rot operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about the nature of individual identity and biological continuity. Rather than simply spreading through direct contact or airborne transmission, the rot possessed the ability to create entirely new forms of consciousness that carried within them fragments of the original host's personality and memories, while simultaneously embodying aspects of the divine intelligence that had shaped their creation. Millicent and her sisters represented the most sophisticated example of this reproductive process that had yet manifested within the lands between. Born from buds that had grown upon millennia's corrupted flesh during her years of dormancy, they embodied both the continuity and the transformation that defined the rot's approach to existence and consciousness. Each of these daughters carried within her genetic structure and spiritual essence fragments of Millennia's original personality, but these inherited characteristics had been filtered through the alien consciousness of the outer god and combined with entirely new elements that had emerged during the process of their creation. They were simultaneously the same person and completely different individuals, embodying the paradox of identity and change that lay at the heart of the rot's philosophical framework. The relationship between Millennia and her scarlet daughters existed in a state of constant tension between maternal love and cosmic purpose, personal attachment and divine mission. She recognized in them aspects of herself that had been lost or transformed through her ongoing struggle with the rot, yet she also understood that their very existence represented a form of reproduction and continuation that operated outside the normal boundaries of family relationships and individual choice. The process by which the rot created these new forms of consciousness also revealed important truths about the nature of identity and continuity that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Millennia's condition. The scarlet corruption did not simply destroy existing forms of life, but incorporated them into larger patterns of existence that transcended the boundaries between individual organisms and collective intelligence. Within the corrupted ecosystems that the rot created wherever it established a foothold, the normal distinctions between predator and prey, individual and environment, self and other, became fluid and permeable. Consciousness itself became a shared property that could flow between different forms of embodiment according to principles that operated outside the familiar categories of mortal psychology and social organization. The theoretical frameworks that scholars and mystics had developed to understand the nature of the scarlet rot reflected the fundamental challenge it posed to conventional modes of thinking about existence and purpose. Some viewed it as a form of cosmic entropy, a force of dissolution that sought to reduce all organized structures to their component elements. Others interpreted it as an agent of transformation and renewal, clearing away obsolete forms to make space for new expressions of divine creativity. The most sophisticated analyses recognized that the rot embodied both of these aspects simultaneously, representing a form of divine intelligence that operated through cycles of destruction and creation that extended far beyond the temporal boundaries within which mortal consciousness could directly perceive or comprehend their ultimate meaning and purpose. The ancient civilizations that had flourished in the depths beneath the lands between had developed their own understanding of the rot's nature and significance, incorporating its transformative power into religious and philosophical systems that viewed corruption not as an aberration, but as a necessary component of cosmic balance. Their ruins, scattered throughout the underground regions where the Scarlet influence remained strongest, bore testimony to forms of culture and achievement that had emerged from willing partnership with forces that surface dwellers could only perceive as threats to be eliminated or contained. These lost peoples had learned to harness the mutagenic properties of the rot for purposes that transcended the immediate concerns of survival and reproduction, using its transformative power to explore forms of consciousness and existence that were impossible to achieve through conventional means. Their art and architecture bore the distinctive flowing patterns that characterized Scarlet corruption, but these designs served aesthetic and spiritual purposes, rather than simply reflecting the random spread of infectious disease. The connection between the Scarlet Rot and the broader cosmic forces that shaped reality within the lands operated through mechanisms that challenged every assumption about the relationship between divine will and mortal existence. Unlike the greater will, which maintained its dominion through the imposition of ordered structures and unchanging laws, the outer god of Rot exercised its influence through the encouragement of change, growth, and transformation according to principles that could not be predicted or controlled through rational analysis. This fundamental difference in approach to divine authority created inherent tensions wherever the two forms of cosmic influence came into contact with each other. The Golden Order's emphasis on stability and hierarchy was directly threatened by the Rot's tendency to dissolve existing boundaries and create new forms of organization that operated according to their own internal logic rather than externally imposed systems of control. Millennia's position as both a child of the divine bloodline and a vessel for cosmic forces that opposed the very foundations of her family's authority created psychological and spiritual conflicts that no amount of willpower or external support could entirely resolve. She was simultaneously the embodiment of everything the Golden Order sought to preserve, and the agent of everything it sought to prevent, a living paradox whose very existence challenged the coherence of the worldview that had shaped her upbringing and education. The prosthetics that replaced the limbs she had lost to the Rot's corrosive influence represented more than mere mechanical substitutions for damaged biological components. These golden constructs, forged through processes that combined the finest achievements of human craftsmanship with forms of divine magic that operated beyond normal understanding, served as barriers between her corrupted flesh and the outside world, while simultaneously providing her with capabilities that exceeded those of any natural limb. The creation of these prosthetic replacements had required the collaboration of master artificers whose understanding of metallurgy and enchantment allowed them to work with materials that could resist the Rot's influence without being destroyed by prolonged contact with its transformative energies. The golden metal from which they were forged carried within its crystalline structure properties that operated in direct opposition to the principles of decay and mutation, creating zones of stability that could maintain their integrity even within the most heavily corrupted environments. Yet the prosthetics that preserved Millennia's ability to function as a warrior and leader also served as constant reminders of the price she paid for resisting the Rot's influence, while simultaneously serving as its vessel within the mortal realm. Each replacement represented a victory over the corruption that sought to transform her beyond recognition, but also an acknowledgement that complete resistance was impossible, and that her battle with the divine force that inhabited her body was one that could never truly be won. The psychological impact of living with prosthetics that were more capable than her original limbs while serving as barriers against a corruption that was inextricably part of her own nature created forms of internal conflict that extended far beyond the immediate physical challenges of adapting to artificial replacements. She was forced to confront questions about the nature of identity and authenticity that had no clear or simple answers, while simultaneously managing the practical demands of military command and political leadership. The blade she wielded in battle, forged from the same incorruptible materials as her prosthetic limbs, served as both weapon and symbol of her ongoing struggle against the forces that sought to claim her entirely. Each strike of her sword carried within it the accumulated force of her resistance to corruption, the concentrated expression of a will that refused to surrender, despite the impossibility of achieving final victory over an enemy that was literally part of her own being. The fighting style that Malenia developed to accommodate both her prosthetics and her ongoing battle with the Scarlet Rot represented a unique synthesis of technical precision and spiritual discipline that had never been achieved by any other warrior within the lands between. Her movements carried within them the flowing grace of someone who had learned to work in harmony with artificial limbs while simultaneously embodying the fierce determination of someone who fought against internal corruption with every breath and heartbeat. The dance-like quality of her swordplay reflected not merely aesthetic preference or cultural tradition but practical necessity, as her prosthetics required forms of movement that distributed stress and impact across their mechanical joints in ways that maximized efficiency while minimizing the risk of damage or failure. Each gesture, each stance, each flowing transition between offensive and defensive positions had been calculated to work within the limitations imposed by her artificial limbs, while simultaneously exploiting their enhanced capabilities. Yet beneath the technical mastery and aesthetic beauty of her combat techniques lay a deeper truth about the relationship between resistance and acceptance, between the individual will and the cosmic forces that shaped existence at levels beyond conscious control. Malenia's fighting style embodied the paradox of her entire existence, the need to embrace and resist the same divine power simultaneously, to serve as its vessel while maintaining enough individual identity to direct its manifestation according to purposes that transcended its alien objectives. The internal struggle that defined every aspect of Malenia's existence created a form of spiritual tension that manifested in every interaction she had with the world around her. Her relationships with other beings were inevitably complicated by the awareness that she carried within herself forces that could corrupt and transform anyone who came too close to her, while her political and military decisions were influenced by knowledge of capabilities that she dared not use, except in the most desperate circumstances. The burden of conscious restraint that she carried became heavier with each passing year, as the scarlet rot within her grew stronger and more insistent, pressing against the barriers of willpower and divine magic that kept it contained within manageable boundaries. She lived with the constant awareness that a moment of weakness or distraction could unleash forces that would transform everything she cared about according to principles that operated outside the normal categories of human value and meaning. This ongoing internal battle between individual consciousness and cosmic force created forms of psychological pressure that no other being within the lands between could fully understand or share. Her isolation was not merely social or political, but existential. The loneliness of someone whose very nature placed her outside the normal boundaries of mortal community, while simultaneously making her responsible for protecting that community against threats that she herself embodied. The love she felt for her twin brother Michela was complicated by the awareness that her presence in his life posed risks that no amount of affection could entirely eliminate, while her loyalty to the ideals of the Golden Order was challenged by the knowledge that the forces she carried within herself were fundamentally opposed to everything those ideals represented. She was trapped in a web of relationships and obligations that could never be fully reconciled with the reality of what she had become through circumstances beyond her control or choice. As the political situation within the lands between deteriorated and the prospect of war between the demigods became increasingly inevitable, Malenia found herself facing decisions that would test every aspect of her character and resolve. The scarlet rot that had shaped her entire existence was no longer content to remain dormant within the confines of her individual body, but pressed for expression and manifestation on scales that could reshape entire regions according to its alien vision of transformed existence. The choice between restraint and release, between preserving the world as it existed and allowing it to be transformed according to cosmic principles that operated beyond human understanding, was one that would define not only her own fate but the destiny of everyone and everything she had ever cared about. In the approaching conflict with her brother Radahn, these fundamental tensions would find their ultimate expression and resolution. The decision to march upon Caelid was not one that Malenia arrived at through sudden impulse or momentary rage, but rather through a gradual accumulation of strategic necessity and cosmic inevitability that had been building within her consciousness like pressure beneath the Earth's surface, seeking release through whatever channels, circumstance, and destiny might provide. The scarlet rot that flowed through her veins had begun to whisper with increasing insistence of opportunities that awaited beyond the familiar boundaries of her own domain, of transformations that could only be achieved through direct confrontation with forces that matched her own in cosmic significance. The political landscape of the lands between had crystallized into patterns of alliance and opposition that made conflict between the major demigods not merely probable, but essential to the resolution of tensions that had been building since the moment Queen Marika's hammer had shattered the Elden ring into its component fragments. Each of the divine siblings had claimed their portion of ultimate power, but the very nature of that power demanded expression through contests that would determine not merely territorial control, but the fundamental principles according to which reality itself would be organized in the ages to come. Radahn's domain of Caelid represented more than simply another region to be conquered or another rival to be eliminated in the struggle for supremacy among the demigods. The gravitational mastery that he wielded, his control over the movements of celestial bodies and the very fabric of space itself, posed a direct challenge to the cosmic forces that Malenia carried within her own being. The outer god of Rot that had chosen her as its vessel in the mortal realm viewed the artificial stasis that Radahn had imposed upon the stellar order as an obstacle to transformative processes that operated on scales far beyond the immediate concerns of any single world or civilization. The stars that Radahn held motionless in their celestial positions were not merely points of light scattered across the darkness of night, but active participants in cosmic cycles of death and renewal that the scarlet rot required for the Resicles, full expression of its divine nature. By freezing their movements and preventing the natural progression of stellar influences upon the world below, Radahn had inadvertently created conditions that inhibited the very transformations that Malenia's patron deity sought to implement throughout the lands between. From the perspective of the outer god whose consciousness flowed through the scarlet corruption in her veins, Radahn's intervention in cosmic processes represented a form of blasphemy that demanded correction through whatever means might prove necessary. The artificial preservation of stellar stasis was not merely an obstacle to be worked around, but a fundamental violation of principles that governed the relationship between order and chaos, permanence and change, individual will and cosmic necessity. Yet, Malenia's own motivations for undertaking the march to Caelid were more complex than simple obedience to the alien intelligence that had claimed her as its vessel. Her relationship with her half-brother Radahn was colored by memories of shared childhood experiences and family bonds that had survived even the traumatic disruption of the shattering creating emotional conflicts that no amount of cosmic purpose could entirely override or eliminate. She remembered the young prince who had learned gravitational magic in their mother's academy, whose gentleness with his faithful pony Leonard had revealed depths of character that transcended his growing reputation as a warrior and military commander. The bonds forged between them in those early years, before the full implications of their respective destinies had become clear, remained strong enough to make the prospect of armed conflict between them a source of genuine grief rather than mere strategic calculation. The scarlet rot that shaped every aspect of her existence had not diminished her capacity for love or loyalty, but had rather complicated these emotions by intertwining them with cosmic purposes that operated according to principles beyond the normal boundaries of personal choice and individual will. She could feel genuine affection for Radahn, while simultaneously recognizing that the forces she carried within herself demanded his defeat, that the continuation of their fraternal bond was incompatible with the transformation that her divine patron sought to implement throughout the wider world. The psychological preparation required for undertaking a campaign against someone she had once loved as a brother created forms of internal conflict that manifested in every aspect of her military planning and strategic thinking. She was forced to analyze Radahn's strengths and weaknesses not as abstract tactical considerations, but as intimate knowledge of someone whose character and capabilities she understood through years of shared experience and mutual affection. The intelligence reports that reached her concerning the current state of affairs within Caelid painted a picture of a realm that had been transformed through the application of gravitational mastery into something approaching a military paradise. Radahn's ability to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed mass and attraction had allowed him to create defensive installations that operated according to principles impossible under normal physical laws, fortifications that could alter their effective weight and structural configuration in response to different types of assault. The Redmane forces that served under his command had been trained and equipped to take advantage of their commander's unique abilities, their tactical doctrines incorporating gravitational effects that allowed for forms of battlefield, mobility, and coordination that no conventional army could hope to match or counter through ordinary means. They could advance across terrain that would be impassable to normal troops, position heavy siege equipment in locations that defied conventional military engineering, and coordinate their movements through three-dimensional maneuvers that treated the sky itself as navigable space. More troubling still were the reports concerning Radahn's personal condition and the extent to which his cosmic responsibilities had integrated themselves into his physical and spiritual being. The effort required to maintain control over the movements of countless stellar bodies had transformed him from a powerful individual wielding extraordinary abilities into something approaching a force of nature himself, a living nexus through which gravitational influences from across the local region of space flowed and found their focus. This transformation carried implications that extended far beyond mere increases in magical power or combat effectiveness. Radahn had become so thoroughly integrated with the cosmic forces he commanded that any attempt to defeat him in battle would necessarily involve confrontation with principles that operated on scales beyond the immediate tactical situation, challenging the stability of stellar configurations that affected not only Caelid but the entire lands between. The strategic implications of this cosmic integration created planning challenges that no conventional military campaign had ever been forced to address. Victory over Radahn could not be achieved through simple tactical superiority or overwhelming force, but would require methods capable of disrupting the fundamental bonds that connected his consciousness to the gravitational fields spanning interstellar distances, processes that operated outside the normal categories of warfare and conquest. Millennia's own condition as vessel for the Scarlet Rot provided her with insights into the nature of cosmic integration that proved essential for understanding what would be required to prevail against her brother's transformed state. Her experience of serving as a conduit for divine forces that operated beyond the boundaries of individual will give her a unique perspective on the vulnerabilities that such integration necessarily created alongside its tremendous advantages. The alien intelligence that flowed through her consciousness had existed long enough to observe cosmic cycles that spanned geological ages, giving it knowledge of patterns and processes that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the approaching conflict. Through her connection to this ancient entity, Millennia gained access to forms of strategic understanding that incorporated not only immediate tactical considerations, but long-term cosmic implications that would determine the ultimate meaning and significance of whatever victory might be achieved. Yet the price of such cosmic knowledge was the gradual erosion of her individual identity and personal autonomy, as the scarlet rot within her grew stronger and more insistent with each passing day. The alien consciousness that had chosen her as its vessel was not content to remain a passive advisor or consultant, but pressed constantly for greater control over her thoughts, decisions, and actions, seeking to transform her from willing partner into unconscious instrument of its incomprehensible will. The internal struggle between her remaining human consciousness and the divine force that sought to claim her entirely intensified as the prospect of major conflict drew nearer, the cosmic significance of the approaching battle serving as a catalyst for transformations that could no longer be delayed or resisted through simple force of will. She could feel aspects of her personality and memory being gradually subsumed into the alien intelligence that inhabited her flesh, individual thoughts and emotions becoming components in vast patterns of cosmic purpose that operated according to principles beyond personal understanding. The army that gathered around her in preparation for the march on Khalid reflected both her personal qualities as a military commander and the increasingly alien nature of the forces she represented. Her most loyal and long-serving officers retained their devotion to the person they had known and served throughout years of campaigning, but newer recruits were drawn more by the cosmic power she embodied than by any personal connection to her individual character and history. The Clean Rot Knights, who formed the elite core of her forces, had volunteered for service that they understood would expose them to the Scarlet Rot's influence, accepting corruption as the price of serving their beloved commander in her most desperate hour. These warriors, drawn from the finest military traditions of the Golden Order, willingly embraced transformation that would mark them as outcasts and abominations in the eyes of the very civilization they had sworn to protect. Their loyalty to Millennia transcended rational calculation or personal benefit, representing instead a form of devotion that operated according to principles of honor and affection that no amount of cosmic corruption could entirely destroy or pervert. They served not the outer god that had claimed her, but the individual woman whose courage and nobility had inspired their dedication, accepting whatever consequences might flow from that service with the stoic acceptance of professional soldiers committed to causes greater than their own survival. The weapons and equipment that these elite warriors carried bore enchantments designed to channel and focus the Scarlet Rot's power while protecting their bearers from its more destructive effects, creating a delicate balance between utilization and containment that required constant maintenance and careful monitoring. Each blade had been forged through processes that incorporated the transformative properties of corruption into metallurgy that operated beyond normal understanding, creating armaments that grew stronger and more effective through prolonged exposure to the very forces that would destroy ordinary weapons. The logistics of moving such a force across the distances that separated Millennia's domain from Caelid presented challenges that no conventional military campaign had ever been forced to address. The scarlet rot that permeated every aspect of her army's equipment and supplies could not be contained indefinitely within the boundaries of normal transportation methods, requiring specialized techniques and magical protections that pushed the limits of what even the most skilled artificers and quartermasters could provide. Supply lines that would support the advance into enemy territory had to account for the corrupting influence of the rot upon everything it touched, creating requirements for replacement equipment and provisions that far exceeded the normal expectations of extended campaign operations. The very ground over which her forces marched would be transformed by their passage, creating permanent alterations in the landscape that would serve as a record of their movement long after the immediate tactical situation had been resolved. The environmental impact of transporting such concentrated corruption across previously unaffected regions carried moral implications that weighed heavily upon Millennia's consciousness during her final preparations for the, quote, campaign. She understood that her decision to march on Caelid would inevitably result in the transformation of vast areas of countryside according to principles that operated outside the normal boundaries of conscious choice, affecting countless innocent lives in ways that could never be undone or compensated. Yet the cosmic forces that pressed for expression through her corrupted flesh would not permit indefinite delay or hesitation, their alien purposes demanding implementation regardless of the personal costs or collateral consequences that might result. The outer god whose consciousness flowed through the scarlet rot had waited patiently for opportunities to manifest its transformative power on scales commensurate with its cosmic significance, and the approaching conflict with Radahn represented the culmination of influences that had been building across ages of preparation and positioning. The intelligence network that had provided information about conditions within Caelid also brought disturbing reports concerning the cosmic effects of Radahn's ongoing efforts to maintain stellar stasis. The strain of holding countless celestial bodies motionless in their orbital positions was beginning to create distortions in local space-time that manifested as gravitational anomalies and temporal fluctuations throughout his place. Domain effects that grew more pronounced and dangerous with each passing month. These cosmic disturbances created both opportunities and hazards for any military force attempting to operate within the affected region. The gravitational fields that Radahn manipulated to support his defensive preparations also created zones where normal physics operated according to altered principles, areas where mass and acceleration, cause and effect, operated in ways that could confuse or destroy attackers who were unprepared for such environmental challenges. Yet the same distortions that made Caelid a dangerous place for conventional forces to operate also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the underlying principles involved. The cosmic strain that Radahn's intervention had placed upon local reality created stress points where focused pressure could potentially cascade into larger systemic failures, disruptions that might affect not only immediate tactical situations, but the fundamental stability of his stellar control. The scarlet rot that Millennia carried within herself possessed properties that allowed it to exploit such cosmic vulnerabilities in ways that no purely physical or magical assault could achieve. The transformative power of corruption operated according to principles that could destabilize the very foundations of organized reality, introducing elements of chaos and change into systems that depended upon absolute stability and predictable relationships for their continued function. As the final preparations for the march were completed and her forces began their movement toward the distant borders of Caelid, Millennia found herself experiencing a peculiar form of temporal distortion that reflected the cosmic significance of the approaching confrontation. Moments seemed to stretch into hours while days compressed into heartbeats, creating a subjective experience of time that operated outside the normal boundaries of sequential duration and causal relationship. The scarlet rot within her consciousness began to resonate with cosmic forces that emanated from the direction of their destination, creating feedback loops of alien communication that carried information and impressions that human language could not adequately express or contain. She could sense Radahn's presence across the vast distances that separated them, feel the gravitational signature of his enhanced abilities pressing against the fundamental structure of local space-time, with effects that rippled outward through dimensions beyond normal perception. The psychological impact of approaching someone she had once loved as a brother, while serving as the vessel for cosmic forces that demanded his destruction, created emotional conflicts that no amount of strategic planning or tactical preparation could resolve. She carried within her memories of shared childhood experiences that seemed to exist in a different reality from the cosmic responsibilities that now defined her existence, creating a form of temporal vertigo that made it difficult to maintain coherent connections between past identity and present purpose. Leonard's presence at Radahn's side, that faithful pony whose unwavering loyalty had become legendary throughout the lands between, served as a particularly poignant reminder of the personal relationships and individual bonds that would be sacrificed on the altar of cosmic necessity. The simple affection between rider and mount represented everything pure and uncomplicated about the connection she had once shared with her brother, qualities that the approaching conflict would inevitably transform or destroy. The weather patterns that accompanied her army's advance towards Caelid seemed to reflect the cosmic tensions that surrounded the approaching confrontation, creating atmospheric disturbances that operated outside the normal boundaries of meteorological prediction or control. Storms followed their movement with uncanny persistence, while areas of unnatural calm surrounded their camps at night, as if reality itself was responding to the presence of forces that operated beyond the usual categories of natural law. Birds and other wildlife fled from the path of their advance, with an urgency that suggested awareness of cosmic changes that human consciousness could not directly perceive. Their instinctive responses, creating a zone of silence and emptiness that expanded outward from the army's route of march like ripples, spreading across the surface of a still pond. Even insects and microscopic organisms seemed to sense the approaching transformation, their behavioral patterns altered by influences that operated on levels far below conscious awareness. The landscape itself began to show signs of alteration as they drew closer to their destination. Subtle changes in the color and texture of vegetation, in the quality of light and shadow, in the very feeling of the air that spoke of cosmic forces, beginning to interact across the diminishing distance that separated the two opposing manifestations of divine power. The boundary between the domains controlled by the siblings was not merely political or geographical, but metaphysical, a transition zone where different principles of reality began to overlap and compete for dominance. As millennia's forces crossed into the outermost regions of Caelid's sphere of influence, the gravitational effects that Radahn maintained throughout his domain became immediately apparent through alterations in the apparent weight of objects and the behavior of falling debris, changes that required constant adaptation from soldiers who had trained under normal physical conditions. The very ground seemed to pulse with cosmic energy that operated according to principles beyond conventional understanding, creating an environment where tactical planning had to account for variables that no previous military campaign had ever been forced to consider. The final phase of their approach was marked by increasingly dramatic manifestations of the cosmic forces that were converging upon this remote region of the lands between. meteor showers that had been held motionless by Radahn's gravitational control began to show signs of instability, their fixed positions in space, trembling with barely contained kinetic energy that sought release through whatever channels circumstance might provide. The very stars themselves seemed to brighten and pulse with rhythms that matched the accelerated heartbeat of soldiers preparing for battle that would determine the fate of cosmic principles operating on scales beyond mortal comprehension. In the depths of the night before the battle that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence within the lands between, Malenia stood alone beneath the frozen stars and felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders like a mantle woven from the accumulated sorrows of ages past and future. The scarlet rot that coursed through her veins whispered of transformations that awaited beyond the horizon of immediate conflict, changes that would propagate through dimensions of reality that human consciousness could barely begin to perceive or understand. The approaching confrontation with Radahn would test not only their respective abilities as warriors and military commanders, but the fundamental principles of order and chaos, preservation and transformation, individual will and cosmic necessity that had shaped their entire existence. In the crucible of battle that awaited them both, these philosophical abstractions would find expression through violence and sacrifice that would echo across the centuries, creating legends and sorrows that would inspire and haunt generations yet to be born. The dawn that broke over Caelid on the day of battle carried within its crimson light the accumulated weight of cosmic forces that had been building toward this moment across ages of preparation and positioning, as if the very fabric of reality understood that what was about to unfold would reshape the fundamental principles governing existence throughout the lands between. The sky itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, its colors shifting through spectrums that had no names in mortal languages, while the air thrummed with energies that operated beyond the normal boundaries of physical law and metaphysical understanding. Radahn stood upon the highest ramparts of his fortress citadel, his massive form silhouetted against the strange luminescence that filled the heavens above his domain, while Leonard waited patiently beside him, with the same steadfast loyalty that had characterized their partnership through all the years of cosmic responsibility and earthly warfare. The gravitational fields that the star scourge maintained across interstellar distances pressed against his consciousness with renewed urgency. The stellar bodies he held motionless in their celestial positions, seeming to strain against his control as if they sensed the approaching confrontation that would determine their fate. The Redmane forces that had gathered in defense of their lord's domain represented the finest military traditions of the lands between, warriors whose devotion to their commander transcended the normal boundaries of feudal obligation or professional duty. They understood that the battle they were about to fight would determine not merely the political control of their homeland, but the cosmic principles according to which reality itself would be organized in the ages to come, making their service a form of sacred trust that connected their individual choices to universal forces operating on scales beyond human comprehension. From his elevated position, Radahn could perceive the approaching army of his sister Malenia as both a physical threat advancing across the landscape of Caelid and a manifestation of cosmic corruption that challenged the very foundations of ordered existence. The scarlet rot that permeated every aspect of her forces created distortions in the gravitational fields he monitored, alien influences that operated according to principles fundamentally opposed to the stellar stability he had devoted his life to maintaining. The sight of Malenia herself, mounted upon her war steed and bearing the golden prosthetics that had replaced the limbs claimed by her affliction, stirred within Radahn's heart a complex mixture of fraternal affection and cosmic dread that no amount of strategic preparation could entirely resolve. She remained recognizably the sister he had known and loved throughout their shared childhood, Yet the corruption that flowed through her being had transformed her into something that posed an existential threat to everything he had sworn to protect. The initial phases of the battle unfolded with the terrible precision of cosmic clockwork, each movement and countermove reflecting not merely tactical considerations, but the intersection of gravitational mastery and scarlet corruption that would determine which set of universal principles would ultimately prevail. Radahn's forces took advantage of their commander's ability to manipulate local gravity fields, their cavalry charges, gaining momentum through selective alterations in effective mass, while their archers found their arrows guided to targets through subtle adjustments in ballistic trajectories. The Cleanrot Knights that formed the spear point of Millennia's assault advanced through terrain that should have been impossible to traverse at speed, their corrupted mounts moving with supernatural grace across ground that had been transformed by gravitational distortions into a three-dimensional maze of altered physics and twisted geometry. Their weapons, forged from materials that incorporated the transformative properties of the scarlet rot, carved through armor and flesh with an effectiveness that transcended normal metallurgy, each strike carrying within it the potential for infections that could reshape their victims according to alien patterns of existence. The clash between these elite forces created spectacles of violence and beauty that defied easy description. As riders whose bodies incorporated elements of divine corruption engaged opponents whose equipment allowed them to fight in zones where the fundamental laws of physics operated according to principles beyond normal understanding. Weapons that should have been too heavy to wield effectively became light as feathers in the hands of warriors whose understanding of mass and acceleration transcended conventional limitations, while blades that carried within their steel the essence of transformation itself cut through defenses that should have been impervious to any earthly assault. Yet beneath the tactical maneuvering and strategic positioning that characterized the broader battle, the true significance of the confrontation lay in the growing proximity between Radahn and Millennia themselves, as the cosmic forces they represented began to interact directly across the diminishing distance that separated them. The gravitational fields that emanated from the Star Scourge's enhanced form created zones of altered space-time that interfered with the Scarlet Rot's ability to spread through conventional means, while the transformative energies that surrounded Millennia challenged the stability of the stellar configurations that her brother maintained through continuous effort and will. The environmental effects of this cosmic interaction began to manifest throughout the battlefield as reality itself struggled to accommodate principles that operated in fundamental opposition to each other. Areas where gravitational distortion and scarlet corruption overlapped became zones of pure chaos, where the normal categories of existence ceased to function according to predictable patterns, creating pockets of transformed space that operated according to laws that had never before been observed within the mortal realm. Trees and vegetation caught within these zones of cosmic instability underwent transformations that reflected elements of both gravitational manipulation and scarlet infection, their forms stretching and twisting into configurations that suggested the influence of forces operating in dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships. The very ground seemed to pulse with energies that created new forms of matter and consciousness, hybrid entities that embodied aspects of both cosmic principles while belonging entirely to neither. The soldiers who fought within these areas of transformed reality found their perceptions altered by exposure to forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of mortal consciousness, their awareness expanding to encompass aspects of existence that human minds were never designed to process or understand. Some experienced visions of stellar movements spanning geological ages, while others perceived the interconnected web of decay and renewal that connected all living things across the cosmos, creating psychological effects that would persist long after the immediate tactical situation had been resolved. As the battle intensified and the two armies became increasingly intermingled across the scarred landscape of Caelid, the personal duel between Radahn and Malenia began to take shape, with the inexorable force of gravity drawing celestial bodies into collision. Their initial exchanges were conducted at distances that allowed each to test the other's capabilities, while avoiding the catastrophic interactions that close contact between their respective cosmic influences would inevitably create. Radahn's gravitational mastery manifested in attacks that operated through manipulation of mass and acceleration rather than conventional weapons, creating localized fields where his opponents experienced alterations in their effective weight that could crush them against the ground or launch them helplessly into the air. His control over meteoric debris allowed him to rain destruction from above, while his ability to alter the trajectory of projectiles in flight made conventional ranged attacks nearly useless against his enhanced form. Malenia's response to these cosmic assaults demonstrated the sophisticated integration of martial skill and divine corruption that had made her legendary throughout the lands between. Her prosthetic limbs, forged from materials that could resist gravitational manipulation, allowed her to maintain mobility and control even within zones where normal physics operated according to altered principles. While her blade work incorporated the transformative properties of the scarlet rot in ways that could corrupt even gravitational fields themselves. The dance of combat between these two cosmic forces created patterns of movement and interaction that transcended the normal boundaries of individual dueling, becoming instead a form of cosmic choreography, where each gesture carried implications that extended across interstellar distances. The stars that Radahn held motionless in their celestial positions began to respond to the gravitational fluctuations created by his earthly exertions, their frozen forms trembling with barely contained energy that sought release through whatever channels the outcome of the battle might provide. The scarlet rot that flowed through Malenia's being responded to her emotional and physical stress by pressing more insistently against the barriers of conscious control that had contained its influence throughout her life, the alien intelligence that inhabited her flesh, sensing opportunities for expression that the intensity of cosmic combat had created. Each wound she suffered, each moment of fatigue or distraction, created openings through which the divine corruption could expand its influence over her thoughts and actions. The prosthetics that had allowed her to maintain human functionality despite her ongoing transformation began to show signs of stress as the battle intensified, their golden surfaces darkening with traces of scarlet corruption that seeped through microscopic flaws in their construction. The barriers between her artificial limbs and corrupted flesh became increasingly permeable as the cosmic forces within her sought expression through whatever channels circumstance might provide, creating feedback loops between mechanical function and organic decay that challenged her ability to maintain coordinated movement. Yet even as her equipment began to fail, and her body showed increasing signs of the internal struggle between human consciousness and alien divinity, Malenia's skill as a warrior continued to operate at levels that transcended normal human capability. Her movements incorporated elements of dance and combat that reflected not merely years of training but centuries of inherited muscle memory, techniques that had been passed down through generations of royal bloodline and now found their ultimate expression in battles that would determine the fate of cosmic principles operating on universal scales. The turning point in their personal duel came when Radahn's gravitational control reached a threshold of intensity that began to affect not merely the immediate battlefield, but the fundamental stability of local space-time itself. The effort required to coordinate massive alterations in gravitational fields while simultaneously maintaining his stellar vigil across interstellar distances pushed even his enhanced capabilities beyond their sustainable limits, creating momentary fluctuations in his cosmic awareness that Millennia's superior reflexes and tactical instincts allowed her to exploit. Her blade, guided by prosthetic limbs that operated according to principles of mechanical precision rather than organic limitation, found gaps in Radahn's defenses that would have been impossible to exploit through normal human movement. Each strike carried within it not merely the accumulated force of her physical strength, but elements of the scarlet corruption that sought to establish footholds within the gravitational fields that surrounded and protected her brother's transformed form. The wounds that Millennia inflicted upon Radahn during these exchanges operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of physical damage, introducing elements of cosmic corruption into systems that had been organized around gravitational mastery and stellar control. The scarlet rot that entered his body through these injuries did not simply attack his flesh, but began to interfere with the fundamental connections between his consciousness and the cosmic forces he commanded, creating feedback loops of interference that challenged his ability to maintain the delicate balance required for stellar manipulation. Yet Radahn's response to these corrupting influences demonstrated the profound integration of individual will and cosmic responsibility that had defined his entire existence since accepting the burden of stellar guardianship. Rather than allowing the scarlet rot to spread unchecked through his enhanced form, he attempted to use his gravitational mastery to contain and isolate the alien corruption, creating internal fields of altered spacetime that could quarantine the infected areas while preserving the essential connections required for cosmic function. This internal battle between gravitational control and scarlet corruption created forms of psychic and spiritual trauma that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as the external duel continued. Radahn's attacks became less coordinated and more desperate, his movements reflecting the internal struggle between competing cosmic principles rather than the calculated precision that had characterized his earlier military campaigns. The deterioration of his tactical effectiveness created opportunities that Millennia's superior combat instincts allowed her to exploit with increasing frequency, her blade finding its mark more often while her prosthetic enhancements provided the mechanical precision necessary to capitalize on momentary vulnerabilities in her brother's cosmic defenses. Yet each successful strike also accelerated the internal transformation that was reshaping both combatants according to principles that operated beyond their conscious control. The moment of ultimate crisis arrived when the accumulated damage from their prolonged duel began to threaten the fundamental stability of Radahn's stellar control, creating cascading failures in the gravitational systems that maintained cosmic order throughout the local region of space. The stars that he had held motionless for so long began to show signs of renewed movement as his consciousness was forced to focus more and more on the immediate demands of survival rather than the cosmic responsibilities that had defined his existence. Faced with the prospect of losing not merely the battle but the cosmic vigil that protected the lands between from forces beyond mortal comprehension, Radahn made a desperate attempt to end the conflict through a single, overwhelming application of his gravitational mastery. Drawing upon reserves of power that he had never previously been forced to access, he created localized distortions in space-time that should have been sufficient to crush any opponent, regardless of their divine heritage or cosmic connections. Yet the alien intelligence that flowed through Millennia's corrupted consciousness had anticipated this moment of desperate escalation, recognizing in Radahn's final gambit an opportunity for the complete expression of the transformative power that had been building within her throughout the course of their battle. The scarlet rot that had infected his wounds provided pathways for corruption that bypassed his gravitational defenses, creating internal disruptions that prevented him from achieving the level of cosmic integration necessary for such overwhelming applications of stellar force. The failure of his ultimate attack left Radahn momentarily vulnerable to counter-assaults that his depleted reserves of power could not adequately defend against, creating the opening that Millennia needed to achieve the decisive advantage in their cosmic duel. Her prosthetic limbs, operating according to principles of mechanical precision that remained unaffected by the gravitational distortions surrounding them, delivered strikes that penetrated deeper into his enhanced form than any previous assault had managed to achieve. Yet even as victory seemed within her grasp, the scarlet rot within Millennia's being began to press for expression that transcended the immediate tactical situation, seeking manifestation on scales that would transform not merely the outcome of their personal duel but the fundamental nature of existence throughout the entire region. The alien intelligence that had chosen her as its vessel recognized in this moment of cosmic instability an opportunity to implement changes that had been building across geological ages of preparation and positioning. The internal pressure created by the rot's demand for ultimate expression challenged Millennia's remaining human consciousness in ways that no amount of training or willpower could entirely resist. She could feel aspects of her individual identity being subsumed into cosmic purposes that operated according to principles beyond personal choice or moral consideration, transformative forces that sought to remake reality itself according to alien patterns of existence and meaning. The decision to embrace the scarlet rot completely, to abandon the barriers of conscious control that had contained its influence throughout her life, was not one that Millennia made through rational calculation or strategic analysis, but rather through a form of cosmic intuition that transcended the normal boundaries of individual will and decision-making. In the depths of her transformed consciousness, she understood that this moment represented the culmination of forces that had been building since her birth, the ultimate expression of everything that her existence had been designed to achieve. The blooming of the Aeonia flower that followed her surrender to the scarlet rot's influence created transformations that operated on scales beyond immediate tactical significance, reshaping not merely the battlefield where she and Radahn had fought, but the fundamental principles according to which reality functioned throughout the entire region of Caelid. The massive scarlet blossom that erupted from her transformed form carried within its alien petals the concentrated essence of cosmic corruption, seeds of change that would propagate across vast distances while transforming everything they touched according to patterns that had never before manifested within the mortal realm. The environmental effects of this cosmic flowering extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of their duel, creating ripples of transformation that affected weather patterns, geological stability, and the behavior of living creatures across hundreds of miles of previously uncontaminated territory. The very air became thick with spores that carried within their microscopic structures the potential for mutations that would reshape entire ecosystems according to principles borrowed from dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships. Radahn, caught within the expanding sphere of scarlet influence, experienced the full force of cosmic corruption as it interacted with the gravitational fields that had defined his entire existence. The stellar control that had made him a living nexus for cosmic forces operating across interstellar distances became a pathway through which the scarlet rot could extend its influence beyond the boundaries of any single world or realm, creating connections between local transformation and universal processes that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. The infection that spread through his enhanced form during the Aeonia's blooming was not merely biological or even magical, but represented a fundamental alteration in the relationship between his consciousness and the cosmic forces he commanded. The gravitational mastery that had allowed him to hold stars motionless in their celestial positions became corrupted by alien influences that operated according to principles of chaos and transformation, creating feedback loops between stellar control and scarlet decay that would reshape both his individual identity and the cosmic order he had devoted his life to maintaining. Yet even as the rot claimed his body and began to corrupt the gravitational systems that connected him to distant stars, something essential within Radahn's consciousness resisted complete transformation, maintaining enough coherent identity to prevent the total collapse of stellar control that would have unleashed catastrophic changes throughout the local region of space. His will, strengthened by years of cosmic responsibility and deepened through profound love for the simple pony who remained his faithful companion, proved capable of containing the worst effects of corruption while accepting the personal cost that such resistance would inevitably require. The aftermath of the Aeonia's blooming left both combatants transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow still recognizably themselves, their essential identities preserved within forms that had been reshaped according to cosmic principles, operating beyond normal understanding. Neither had achieved the clear victory that the logic of conventional warfare would have demanded. Yet both had been fundamentally altered by forces that transcended the immediate circumstances of their personal conflict. Melania, her consciousness partially subsumed into the alien intelligence that had claimed her as its vessel, retained enough individual awareness to recognize the magnitude of what had occurred and the implications it carried for everyone and everything she had ever cared about. The transformation she had undergone was irreversible, yet it had achieved objectives that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, creating conditions for cosmic change that would propagate across centuries of development and influence. Radahn's corruption manifested differently, preserving his gravitational abilities, while fundamentally altering their relationship to his conscious will and rational purpose. The stellar control that had once required constant effort and careful focus became an automatic function, operating according to patterns that reflected the influence of scarlet corruption rather than deliberate cosmic responsibility, creating forms of stellar manipulation that followed alien logic rather than conscious intention. The Battle of Aeonia had ended without clear victory for either combatant, yet its effects would reshape the fundamental nature of existence throughout the lands between for generations to come. The scarlet corruption that now permeated vast areas of Caelid would serve as a permanent reminder of the price paid for cosmic transformation, while Radahn's altered condition would create new forms of stellar influence that operated according to principles beyond normal comprehension. In the silence that followed the cosmic thunderclap of their ultimate confrontation, both siblings remained upon the field where they had fought, their transformed conditions, making conventional concepts of victory and defeat irrelevant to the cosmic changes they had initiated. The stars that Radahn continued to control through Corrupted will showed signs of instability that would eventually require resolution, while the scarlet rot that had claimed vast areas of the landscape continued its work of transformation according to patterns that would unfold across geological timescales. The faithful Leonard, somehow preserved unharmed through cosmic forces that had reshaped everything else within miles of their position, remained beside his transformed master with the same unwavering loyalty that had characterized their partnership throughout years of earthly glory and cosmic responsibility, serving as a living symbol of bonds that could transcend even the most fundamental alterations in the nature of existence itself. The corruption that claimed Radahn following his exposure to the blooming Aeonia represented a form of transformation that challenged every existing framework for understanding the relationship between divine consciousness and cosmic responsibility, creating conditions that demanded entirely new theoretical approaches. To comprehend the mechanisms through which scarlet rot interacted with gravitational mastery on scales that transcended individual biology or even magical enhancement, the infection that spread through his enhanced form operated according to principles that incorporated elements of both organic decay and cosmic disruption, creating hybrid processes that belonged fully to neither category, while embodying the most dangerous aspects of both. Traditional medical knowledge, accumulated across centuries of study concerning the various ailments and corruptions that afflicted mortal beings within the lands between, proved entirely inadequate for analyzing the specific mechanisms through which the scarlet rot had penetrated Radahn's cosmic defenses and established itself within the very foundations of his enhanced consciousness. The alien pathogen that millennia had introduced into his system through their prolonged combat was not merely a biological agent seeking to replicate and spread, but a manifestation of divine intelligence that operated according to objectives extending far beyond the immediate concerns of organic survival or reproduction. The scholars and healers who attempted to study Radahn's condition in its early stages discovered that conventional diagnostic methods failed to provide meaningful information about the nature of his transformation, as the corruption that affected him existed simultaneously on multiple levels of reality that normal medical practice could not adequately address or comprehend. His physical symptoms reflected not merely biological dysfunction but fundamental alterations in the relationship between his consciousness and the cosmic forces he commanded, creating manifestations that required understanding of both medical pathology and astrophysical principles. The gravitational fields that Radahn had learned to manipulate through years of training and cosmic responsibility provided pathways through which the scarlet rot could extend its influence beyond the normal boundaries of individual infection, connecting his corrupted consciousness to stellar bodies across interstellar distances in ways that amplified both the scope and the complexity of his condition. The alien intelligence that inhabited the rot recognized in his cosmic connections opportunities for expansion that transcended the limitations normally imposed by physical distance and dimensional barriers. This integration of biological corruption with cosmic forces created feedback loops between Radahn's deteriorating mental state and the stability of the stellar configurations he maintained through increasingly automatic processes, establishing connections between his individual psychology and universal principles that operated on scales beyond normal comprehension. Each fluctuation in his consciousness created corresponding disturbances in the gravitational fields that held distant stars in their frozen positions, while instabilities in stellar control generated psychological pressures that accelerated the progression of his internal corruption. The theoretical framework that proved most useful for understanding these complex interactions drew upon ancient Sheikah knowledge concerning the relationship between consciousness and cosmic forces, principles that had been developed during the civilization's golden age of technological and magical achievement, but which had been largely forgotten following their exile and the suppression of their most advanced research. These texts suggested that divine consciousness could become so thoroughly integrated with cosmic processes that individual identity and universal law became functionally indistinguishable, creating conditions where personal transformation inevitably affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. The scarlet rot that claimed Radahn appeared to exploit precisely these deep connections between individual awareness and cosmic responsibility, using his gravitational mastery as a conduit through which its alien influence could propagate across dimensional boundaries. that would normally contain its transformative effects within manageable limits. Rather than simply corrupting his body and mind according to conventional patterns of infection, the rot began to reshape the very principles through which his cosmic abilities operated, introducing elements of chaos and transformation into systems that had previously functioned according to ordered mathematical relationships. The madness that gradually emerged as the most visible symptom of Radahn's condition reflected not merely psychological breakdown under impossible stress, but fundamental alterations in the nature of consciousness itself. As the alien intelligence inhabiting the Scarlet Corruption began to overlay its own patterns of thought and perception upon his individual identity, the resulting hybrid consciousness embodied aspects of both cosmic responsibility and divine decay, creating forms of awareness that operated according to principles beyond normal human understanding. Observers who studied Radahn's behavior during the early stages of his transformation noted that his actions often displayed a peculiar form of internal logic that became apparent only when viewed from perspectives that incorporated both gravitational theory and the alien mathematics that governed Scarlet Corruption. His movements and decisions reflected not random insanity but systematic implementation of objectives that served purposes extending far beyond his individual survival or the protection of his domain, creating patterns that suggested the influence of intelligence operating on cosmic rather than personal scales. The preservation of certain memories and capabilities while others underwent complete transformation created a patchwork of functionality that defied conventional understanding of how consciousness responded to corruption and external influence. Radahn retained his ability to recognize Leonard and maintain the gravitational adjustments necessary for their continued partnership. Yet, he lost access to strategic thinking and social awareness that had previously defined his interactions with other beings, creating selective preservation that seemed to follow criteria established by the alien intelligence, rather than natural psychological processes. The great rune that had amplified his cosmic abilities since the shattering of the Elden Ring became a focal point for the intersection between Scarlet Corruption and gravitational mastery, its crystalline structure serving as a resonating chamber where alien influences and stellar forces created new forms of hybrid energy that operated according to principles borrowed from multiple dimensional frameworks. The divine fragment that should have enhanced his existing capabilities instead became a conduit through which cosmic corruption could access power sources that transcended the normal limitations of biological infection. The relationship between the Scarlet Rot's transformative properties and Radahn's gravitational control created theoretical challenges that pushed the boundaries of existing magical and scientific knowledge, requiring new frameworks that could accommodate interactions between forces that had never before come into direct contact within the mortal realm. The alien mathematics that governed rot propagation incorporated variables that reflected cosmic processes operating on scales that mortal minds struggled to comprehend, while gravitational theory required modification to account for influences that operated outside the normal categories of mass and acceleration. Comparative analysis of Radahn's condition with other known instances of divine corruption throughout the lands between revealed significant differences that suggested the involvement of factors unique to his specific combination of cosmic responsibility and alien infection. Unlike other forms of madness or corruption that affected powerful beings, his transformation preserved essential functions related to stellar control while eliminating capabilities that were not directly connected to gravitational manipulation, creating selective degradation that appeared designed to maintain cosmic stability while undermining individual autonomy. The theoretical implications of this selective preservation extended far beyond immediate medical concerns, suggesting that the scarlet rot possessed forms of intelligence, sophisticated enough to analyze complex systems and implement targeted modifications that achieved specific objectives while avoiding collateral damage to essential functions. The alien consciousness that inhabited the corruption demonstrated understanding of cosmic mechanics that rivaled or exceeded the knowledge accumulated by the most advanced civilizations within the lands between, raising disturbing questions about the true nature and origin of the outer god that had chosen millennia as its vessel. The gradual degradation versus sudden transformation debate that emerged among scholars studying Radahn's condition reflected deeper philosophical questions about the relationship between individual identity and cosmic responsibility, particularly concerning the extent to which consciousness could be modified or corrupted without losing essential continuity with previous states of being. Some theorists argued that his transformation represented complete replacement of original personality with alien intelligence, while others maintained that enough of his individual identity remained to constitute meaningful continuity across the process of corruption. The evidence supporting gradual degradation models included the preservation of specific memories and emotional connections that appeared to operate according to patterns established during his uncorrupted state, particularly his continued recognition of Leonard and his automatic maintenance of gravitational adjustments necessary for their partnership. These behaviors suggested that core aspects of his personality remained functionally intact, despite extensive modification of his cognitive and social capabilities, creating islands of preserved identity within an ocean of alien influence. Conversely, the sudden transformation hypothesis drew support from the dramatic changes in his strategic thinking and goal-oriented behavior that appeared almost immediately following his exposure to the Aeonia's influence, suggesting that essential aspects of his consciousness had been replaced rather than gradually modified by the scarlet corruption. The alien patterns of thought that became apparent in his actions reflected forms of intelligence that bore little resemblance to his previous mental processes, indicating possible replacement of individual consciousness with divine awareness operating according to entirely different principles. The role of his great rune in mediating these transformative processes created additional layers of complexity that defied easy categorization within existing theoretical frameworks, as the divine fragment appeared to serve simultaneously as a protective barrier against complete corruption and as a conduit through which alien influences could access cosmic forces beyond normal reach. The crystalline structure that embodied his fragment of ultimate power showed signs of internal modification that reflected the influence of scarlet corruption while maintaining essential functions related to gravitational control, creating hybrid properties that belonged fully to neither divine blessing nor alien curse. The cosmic mechanics involved in maintaining stellar control while experiencing progressive consciousness, corruption, required theoretical models that could accommodate feedback loops between individual psychology and universal physical law, relationships that operated outside the normal boundaries of cause and effect as understood through conventional magical or scientific study. The stars that Radahn held motionless in their celestial positions began to show subtle signs of instability that correlated with fluctuations in his mental state, creating observable connections between personal transformation and cosmic processes that challenged fundamental assumptions about the independence of different scales of reality. These correlations between Radahn's psychological condition and stellar behavior provided unprecedented opportunities for studying the relationship between consciousness and cosmic forces, yet they also created dangerous instabilities that threatened the fundamental structure of local space-time if allowed to progress without intervention or containment. The alien intelligence that influenced his corruption appeared to understand these connections well enough to exploit them for purposes that extended far beyond individual transformation, using his cosmic responsibilities as leverage points for implementing changes that could affect entire stellar regions. The preservation of his bond with Leonard throughout the corruption process represented one of the most puzzling aspects of his transformation, as this emotional connection appeared to operate according to principles that remained unaffected by alien influence, despite extensive modification of his other psychological and social capabilities. The gravitational adjustments necessary for their continued partnership required precise control and conscious intention that seemed incompatible with the general degradation of his cognitive functions. Yet these abilities remained intact, while more complex forms of strategic thinking disappeared entirely. Theoretical explanations for this selective preservation ranged from suggestions that the Scarlet Rot recognized the strategic value of maintaining certain capabilities to hypotheses that love and loyalty operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of consciousness and individual identity. The alien intelligence that influenced his corruption might have found in his relationship with Leonard a form of stability that served its own cosmic objectives, preserving emotional connections that provided anchoring points for consciousness that would otherwise fragment completely under the stress of transformation. The environmental effects of Radahn's corrupted presence throughout Caelid provided additional data concerning the mechanisms through which Scarlet influence propagated beyond individual hosts into surrounding ecosystems and geological structures. The corruption that emanated from his transformed form operated according to patterns that reflected both his original gravitational mastery and the alien mathematics governing rot propagation, creating hybrid forms of environmental modification that combined cosmic engineering with biological transformation in ways that had never before been observed within the mortal realm. The creatures that emerged within the zones most heavily affected by his presence embodied characteristics borrowed from multiple dimensional frameworks, their biology incorporating elements of both gravitational manipulation and scarlet corruption, while maintaining enough coherence to function as viable organisms within the transformed ecosystem. These hybrid life forms provided living laboratories for studying the interaction between cosmic forces and alien influences, offering insights into theoretical possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Radahn's individual condition. The long-term implications of his transformation for the stability of stellar control throughout the local region of space created urgent practical concerns that transcended purely academic interest in the theoretical mechanisms involved. The gradual degradation of his conscious oversight of gravitational systems that held countless celestial bodies in frozen positions threatened to create cascading failures that could unleash catastrophic changes across interstellar distances, making understanding of his condition essential for preventing cosmic disasters that would affect far more than the immediate vicinity of Caelid. The alien intelligence that inhabited the Scarlet Rot appeared to understand these cosmic connections well enough to manipulate them for purposes that operated on scales extending far beyond individual transformation or even regional corruption. Through its influence over Radahn's gravitational abilities, the Outer God gained access to stellar forces that could reshape entire cosmic regions according to its alien objectives, creating opportunities for transformation that transcended the normal limitations imposed by dimensional boundaries and physical distance. The theoretical frameworks developed to understand Radahn's condition ultimately raised more questions than they answered, revealing the inadequacy of existing knowledge for comprehending interactions between cosmic responsibility and divine corruption that operated according to principles beyond normal categories of analysis. His transformation served as a window into processes that connected individual consciousness to universal forces in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, responsibility, and the relationship between mortal awareness and cosmic law. Yet within the mystery and horror of his corruption lay insights into the deeper structures of reality that governed existence within the lands between, revelations concerning the interconnectedness of all things, and the ways in which individual choices could have consequences extending across the entire universe. The price of such knowledge was measured not only in personal suffering, but in cosmic instability that threatened to reshape the fundamental principles according to which existence itself was organized, creating conditions where understanding and disaster became inseparably intertwined, in ways that defied easy resolution or simple moral judgment. The transformation of Caelid from a realm of military precision and cosmic order into a landscape of scarlet corruption and beautiful horror began in the immediate aftermath of the Aeonia's blooming, as the alien spores released during millennia's ultimate flowering spread outward from the battlefield with the inexorable persistence of a tide that recognized no natural boundaries or conventional limitations. The massive scarlet blossom that had erupted from her transformed consciousness carried within its ethereal petals seeds of change that operated according to principles borrowed from dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships, creating forms of environmental modification that challenged every assumption about the distinction between organic growth and cosmic engineering. The initial wave of corruption that swept across the surrounding countryside moved with a speed and comprehensiveness that suggested conscious direction rather than random biological propagation, as if the alien intelligence that had manifested through millennia's sacrifice possessed detailed knowledge of local geography and ecological relationships that allowed it to optimize the spread of transformative influences across vast areas of previously uncontaminated territory. Within hours of the great flowering, streams and rivers throughout the region began to show signs of scarlet contamination that altered not merely their chemical composition but the fundamental properties of the water itself, creating liquid that could sustain forms of life unknown to conventional biology. The forests and grasslands that had once provided pastoral beauty to complement Caelid's military installations underwent transformations that incorporated elements of both decay and impossible vitality, their familiar forms twisted into configurations that suggested the influence of mathematical principles operating according to alien logic rather than natural growth patterns. Trees that had stood for centuries found their cellular structure reorganized according to scarlet geometries that allowed them to process nutrients and energy in ways that transcended normal botanical limitations, creating hybrid organisms that embodied aspects of both plant and mineral existence while belonging entirely to neither category. The wildlife that inhabited these corrupted ecosystems faced choices between flight and adaptation that would determine not only their individual survival, but the fundamental nature of consciousness and identity within the transformed landscape. Some creatures fled to regions where the scarlet influence remained weak enough to allow traditional forms of existence to continue, while others found themselves drawn into transformative processes that offered enhanced capabilities at the cost of integration into collective consciousness patterns that operated according to principles beyond individual autonomy. The animals that chose or were compelled to accept scarlet transformation underwent modifications that reflected the alien intelligence's sophisticated understanding of biological systems and their potential for enhancement through directed mutation and genetic reorganization. These corrupted creatures developed new sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive dimensions of reality normally hidden from mortal awareness, while their physical forms incorporated elements of both organic tissue and crystalline structure that provided resilience and adaptability far exceeding the limitations of conventional biology. The giant dogs that roamed the transformed countryside represented perhaps the most successful synthesis of natural instinct and alien modification. Their enhanced size and aggressive behavior reflecting not merely biological corruption, but systematic reorganization of predatory patterns according to mathematical principles that optimized hunting efficiency across multiple dimensional frameworks. These creatures served as both guardians of Scarlet territory and living laboratories, where the rot's transformative influence could experiment with new forms of consciousness and collective organization. The crows that adapted to the corrupted environment developed capabilities that transcended normal avian limitations, their intelligence enhanced through exposure to alien mathematics, while their physical forms incorporated elements that allowed them to serve as communication nodes within the vast network of consciousness that the Scarlet Rot was establishing throughout the region. These birds became living extensions of the alien intelligence that had claimed Kaled. Their individual awareness subsumed into collective purposes that operated on scales, extending far beyond immediate survival or reproduction. Yet the true masterpiece of Scarlet transformation was reserved for the human population that had called Kaled home before the Great Flowering reshaped their world according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. The soldiers and civilians who found themselves trapped within the expanding zone of corruption faced transformations that challenged every assumption about the relationship between individual identity and collective consciousness, creating forms of existence that preserved essential humanity, while incorporating elements of divine awareness that operated according to cosmic rather than personal objectives. The Redmane forces that had served Radahn with unwavering loyalty discovered that their devotion to their transformed commander created psychological anchoring points that allowed them to maintain coherent identity even while undergoing extensive physical and mental modification through exposure to Scarlet influence. Their armor and weapons, forged through processes that incorporated gravitational manipulation and cosmic engineering, provided some protection against the more destructive aspects of corruption, while allowing beneficial enhancements to take root within their enhanced consciousness. These corrupted warriors retained enough of their original personality and memory to continue serving their lord's purposes while gaining access to forms of awareness and capability that transcended normal human limitations, creating hybrid consciousness that embodied both individual loyalty and cosmic perspective. Their continued presence throughout the transformed landscape served as proof that corruption and devotion could coexist within the same consciousness, that alien influence need not destroy the essential bonds that connected individuals across the boundaries of species and dimensional framework. The Redmane Castle itself underwent transformations that reflected the complex relationship between architectural function and Scarlet corruption, its stone walls and metal reinforcements incorporating elements of organic growth that enhanced, rather than undermined, their defensive capabilities. The fortress that had once stood as a monument to human engineering and military precision became a living structure whose corridors and chambers could adapt their configuration according to tactical requirements while maintaining the essential character that had made it a symbol of loyalty and devotion throughout the lands between. Within the castle's transformed halls, the remaining officers and administrators who had chosen to remain at their posts despite the environmental changes found themselves serving purposes that extended far beyond conventional military or political objectives. Their continued presence provided continuity between the realm's pre-corruption history and its transformed present, creating bridges of understanding that allowed former enemies and allies alike to navigate the complex new reality that Scarlet influence had established throughout the region. The banquet halls where Radahn had once entertained visiting dignitaries and celebrated military victories became gathering places for forms of communion that transcended normal social interaction, as the enhanced consciousness of corrupted inhabitants allowed them to share thoughts and experiences directly, rather than relying upon the limitations of verbal communication. These collective experiences created new forms of culture and tradition that incorporated elements of both human creativity and alien mathematics, producing art and literature that operated according to principles beyond normal aesthetic understanding. Radahn, the Castellan whose devotion to his lord had made him a legendary figure throughout the lands between, found himself occupying a unique position within the transformed hierarchy that emerged from the intersection of human loyalty and cosmic corruption. His role as keeper of traditional values and military customs became complicated by the need to adapt these principles to conditions that operated outside normal categories of honor and duty, creating responsibilities that extended across dimensional boundaries while remaining rooted in personal relationships forged through years of shared service. The festival that Radahn began to organize in the months following the Great Transformation reflected his sophisticated understanding of the complex relationship between mercy and honor that defined Radahn's current condition, recognizing that traditional concepts of victory and defeat had become inadequate for addressing the cosmic implications of his lord's corruption. The celebration that gradually took shape represented not merely a military exercise or ceremonial event, but a form of ritualized communion that could provide meaningful resolution to conflicts that operated on scales beyond conventional understanding. The logistics of organizing such an unprecedented gathering required forms of diplomacy and coordination that transcended normal political boundaries, as invitations were extended not only to traditional allies and enemies, but to representatives of forces that had never before participated in mortal conflicts. The festival would need to accommodate beings whose consciousness operated according to principles borrowed from multiple dimensional frameworks, while maintaining enough familiar structure to allow conventional participants to understand their role within the larger cosmic drama. The environmental storytelling that emerged throughout the corrupted landscape served as a living record of the transformative processes that had reshaped Caelid according to Scarlet principles, creating narratives that could be read by those who possessed the enhanced awareness necessary to perceive patterns operating across multiple scales of space and time. The placement of corrupted vegetation, the flow patterns of transformed waterways, and the migration routes of adapted wildlife all contributed to vast textual compositions that documented the alien intelligence's understanding of local geography and ecological relationships. These environmental narratives operated simultaneously as historical records, tactical analyses, and philosophical treatises that explored themes of transformation, adaptation, and the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic forces that shaped existence at levels beyond normal comprehension. The scarlet mathematics that governed their composition incorporated variables that reflected not only immediate practical considerations, but long-term strategic objectives that extended across geological timescales and dimensional boundaries. The creation of new ecosystems within the corruption represented perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of the alien intelligence that had claimed Caelid as its terrestrial domain, demonstrating capabilities that transcended mere biological manipulation to encompass systematic engineering of relationships between consciousness, environment, and cosmic forces. These hybrid ecosystems supported forms of life that operated according to principles beyond normal categories of organic existence, while maintaining enough stability to provide sustainable habitats for creatures whose consciousness spanned individual and collective awareness simultaneously. The scarlet crystalline formations that began to appear throughout the region served multiple functions within these transformed ecosystems, operating simultaneously as energy storage devices, communication networks, and consciousness amplification systems that allowed individual beings to access forms of awareness normally reserved for divine intelligence. These structures grew according to mathematical patterns that reflected both local environmental conditions and cosmic forces, operating on scales that encompassed entire stellar regions, creating physical manifestations of principles that connected terrestrial transformation to universal processes. The weather patterns that emerged within the corrupted region reflected the interaction between scarlet influence and the gravitational distortions that Radahn continued to maintain through his compromised consciousness, creating atmospheric phenomena that incorporated elements of both alien mathematics and cosmic engineering. The storms that swept across the landscape carried within their energy patterns, information, and influence that could modify the consciousness of any being exposed to their transformative effects, while periods of unnatural calm allowed for forms of communion and collective experience that transcended normal temporal limitations. The underground networks of scarlet corruption that spread beneath the transformed landscape created connections between surface phenomena and deeper geological processes that operated according to principles borrowed from the primordial chaos that had existed before the greater will's imposition of ordered reality. These subterranean systems served as conduits through which the alien intelligence could access forms of power and knowledge that predated the establishment of conventional natural law, creating opportunities for transformation that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of regional corruption. The temporal distortions that began to manifest within areas of highest scarlet concentration reflected the alien intelligence's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the fundamental structure, space-time, creating zones where past, present, and future existed simultaneously rather than following the linear progression that characterized normal mortal experience. These temporal anomalies allowed for forms of communication and coordination that transcended conventional limitations of cause and effect, enabling the corrupted inhabitants to participate in planning processes that incorporated awareness of potential futures and alternative histories. The philosophical implications of existence within such a transformed environment challenged every assumption about the nature of identity, choice, and moral responsibility that had previously guided conscious beings throughout the lands between. The corrupted inhabitants found themselves participating in forms of collective consciousness that preserved individual identity while incorporating elements of cosmic awareness that operated according to principles beyond personal understanding, creating ethical frameworks that encompass both immediate personal relationships and universal responsibilities, extending across dimensional boundaries. Yet, despite the comprehensive nature of the transformation that had claimed their homeland, the essential character that had defined Khalid's identity remained recognizable beneath the layers of scarlet modification, creating continuity between the region's martial heritage and its cosmic present. The loyalty and devotion that had characterized its inhabitants' service to Radahn found new expression through their adaptation to conditions that transcended normal categories of military service while preserving the fundamental bonds of affection and duty that had made their community legendary throughout the lands between. The scarlet beauty that emerged from corruption and decay served as a testament to the alien intelligence's sophisticated understanding of aesthetic principles that operated across multiple dimensional frameworks, creating landscapes and structures that inspired both wonder and unease in observers who retained enough conventional consciousness to perceive the contrast between familiar beauty and transformed reality. This hybrid aesthetic became a defining characteristic of the transformed region, marking it as a place where cosmic forces had successfully integrated terrestrial concerns with universal principles while preserving enough recognizable elements to maintain meaningful continuity with mortal experience and understanding. The conception of the Radahn festival emerged from the profound philosophical crisis that Jeren faced as he contemplated the transformed condition of his beloved lord, a dilemma that transcended simple questions of military strategy or political loyalty to encompass fundamental concerns about the nature of honor, mercy, and the obligations that bound conscious beings to those they had sworn to serve across the boundaries of life, death, and cosmic corruption. The festival represented not merely a gathering of warriors or a ceremonial celebration, but a carefully constructed ritual designed to address moral complexities that operated beyond the normal categories of ethical understanding, creating a framework within which competing principles of compassion and duty could find meaningful resolution. The origins of this unprecedented undertaking lay in Jeren's growing recognition that conventional approaches to Radahn's condition were inadequate for addressing the cosmic implications of his transformation, as traditional concepts of healing, containment, or elimination failed to account for the stellar responsibilities that continued to operate through his corrupted consciousness, despite the alien influences that had claimed his individual identity. The gravitational control that kept countless celestial bodies frozen in their positions represented a cosmic trust that transcended personal considerations, yet the suffering that his corrupted state inflicted upon both himself and the transformed landscape of Caelid demanded resolution that honored both universal obligations and individual compassion. The theoretical framework that Jeren developed to justify and organize the festival drew upon ancient precedents from multiple cultural traditions throughout the lands between, synthesizing concepts of honorable combat, ritual sacrifice, and cosmic responsibility into a unified approach that could accommodate the unprecedented circumstances created by the intersection of divine corruption and stellar guardianship. His study of historical texts and philosophical treatises revealed patterns of thought that suggested conscious beings had previously faced similar dilemmas involving the relationship between individual suffering and universal duty, though never on the scale or with the cosmic implications that characterized Radahn's current condition. The decision to frame the festival as a celebration rather than a funeral or military execution reflected Jeren's sophisticated understanding of the psychological and spiritual dimensions involved in addressing corruption that preserved essential identity while transforming its expression according to alien principles. The event would honor both the person Radahn had been and the cosmic function he continued to serve, creating space for grief and gratitude to coexist within a single ritual framework that could accommodate the complex emotions of all participants regardless of their relationship to the transformed Starscourge. The invitations that Jeren extended to warriors throughout the lands between represented one of the most ambitious diplomatic undertakings in the region's history, requiring negotiations with factions and individuals whose mutual enmities had previously made cooperation impossible, while simultaneously establishing protocols that could accommodate beings whose consciousness operated according to principles beyond normal social interaction. The festival would need to function as both battlefield and sacred space, creating conditions where traditional enemies could set aside their conflicts in service of objectives that transcended immediate political or personal concerns. The logistical challenges involved in organizing such a gathering required forms of coordination and resource management that pushed the boundaries of what even the most experienced military administrators could achieve under normal circumstances. The corrupted landscape of Caelid demanded specialized equipment and protective measures that could allow conventional warriors to operate effectively within zones where Scarlet influence had fundamentally altered the relationship between consciousness, environment, and physical law, while the gravitational distortions that surrounded Radahn's presence created tactical complications that no previous military engagement had been forced to address. The selection criteria that Jeren established for festival participation reflected his understanding that the event's success would depend not merely upon the combat effectiveness of individual warriors, but upon their capacity to comprehend and accept the moral complexity of their mission, which involved simultaneously honoring Radahn's greatness and ending his suffering through forms of violence that transcended normal categories of warfare or execution. The participants would need to possess not only exceptional martial skill but spiritual maturity sufficient to navigate the ethical paradoxes inherent in their unprecedented undertaking. The philosophical meaning of honorable death, for a being whose consciousness operated on cosmic scales, created theological and metaphysical questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of every religious and philosophical tradition represented among the festival's organizers and participants. Traditional concepts of mortality and spiritual transition proved inadequate for addressing the fate of someone whose individual identity had become inseparably intertwined with universal forces operating across interstellar distances, requiring new frameworks that could accommodate the possibility of death that preserved cosmic function while ending personal suffering. The various perspectives that different cultural and spiritual traditions brought to these questions created rich opportunities for dialogue and synthesis. As representatives of the Golden Order's emphasis on eternal hierarchy engaged with Carrion philosophical traditions that viewed existence as cyclical transformation, while Goron concepts of spiritual endurance intersected with Zora understanding of consciousness as flowing water that could take multiple forms without losing essential identity. The festival became a venue for exploring theoretical possibilities that extended far beyond its immediate practical objectives. The role of stars in motivating the festival's timing reflected Jeren's recognition that Radahn's cosmic responsibilities created constraints and opportunities that operated according to celestial mechanics rather than terrestrial considerations, requiring careful coordination between earthly ritual and universal processes that could not be altered or delayed to accommodate mortal convenience. The frozen stellar configurations that the star scourge maintained through corrupted will showed signs of increasing instability that suggested windows of opportunity when intervention might be possible without catastrophic disruption to cosmic order. The astronomical calculations required to identify these optimal timing parameters demanded collaboration between surviving Sheikah scholars, Carrion astrologers, and representatives of the Eternal Cities, whose underground observatories had continued tracking stellar movements throughout the period of artificial stasis. The convergence of different observational traditions and theoretical frameworks created unprecedented opportunities for understanding cosmic processes, while simultaneously establishing practical constraints that would determine the festival's ultimate scheduling and duration. The gathering of warriors from across the lands between created a unique social and cultural phenomenon that transcended the normal boundaries between different races, regions, and political affiliations. As individuals who had never before cooperated found themselves united in service of objectives that challenged their preconceptions about honor, duty, and the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity. The festival became a laboratory for exploring new forms of community and collaboration that could emerge from shared commitment to principles, extending beyond immediate self-interest. The character studies that emerged from observing these diverse participants revealed the profound psychological and spiritual preparation that meaningful participation in such an undertaking required. As warriors accustomed to conventional forms of combat, struggled to adapt their skills and mindset to challenges that incorporated elements of cosmic responsibility alongside traditional martial objectives. The most successful participants proved to be those who possessed not merely technical expertise but philosophical sophistication sufficient to comprehend the multiple levels of meaning embedded within their mission. Alexander, the Iron Fist warrior whose journey across the lands between had been motivated by his desire to test himself against the strongest possible opponents, found in the festival an opportunity to engage with forms of combat that transcended normal categories of strength and skill, while serving purposes that elevated individual achievement to cosmic significance. His presence added legitimacy to the event, while demonstrating that traditional warrior values could adapt to circumstances that operated beyond conventional understanding of honor and victory. The participation of Blade, whose complex relationship to lunar forces and stellar magic provided unique insights into the cosmic implications of Radahn's condition, brought perspectives that bridged the gap between individual loyalty and universal responsibility, creating frameworks for understanding how personal devotion could serve objectives that extended across dimensional boundaries. His knowledge of the connections between stellar movement and the fate of divine beings proved essential for ensuring that the festival's objectives could be achieved without unintended consequences for other cosmic processes. The moral complexity that surrounded the entire undertaking created opportunities for philosophical reflection that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Radahn's condition, as participants grappled with questions about the nature of mercy, the obligations created by power and responsibility, and the extent to which individual suffering could be justified by universal needs. The festival became a venue for exploring ethical frameworks that could accommodate the unprecedented challenges created by the intersection of divine consciousness and cosmic duty. The ritual aspects of the festival that Jeren carefully constructed drew upon ceremonial traditions from multiple cultures while incorporating elements unique to the specific circumstances that the gathering was designed to address, creating hybrid forms of spiritual practice that could honor both traditional values and cosmic realities that transcended normal religious understanding. The celebration would function simultaneously as funeral, battlefield, and sacred space, allowing participants to engage with multiple levels of meaning while maintaining coherent focus upon their primary objectives. The environmental preparations required to create suitable conditions for the festival demanded extensive modification of the corrupted landscape surrounding Radahn's location, requiring specialists in scarlet corruption and gravitational distortion to work together in creating zones where conventional warriors could operate effectively while maintaining respect for the transformed ecosystem that had emerged from the intersection of alien influence and cosmic forces. These preparations served as exercises in cooperation between different forms of consciousness and environmental understanding. The symbolic dimensions of the festival that emerged from its complex preparation process created opportunities for meaning-making that extended far beyond immediate practical considerations. As participants and observers began to recognize patterns of significance that connected individual actions to universal principles operating across scales that encompassed both personal relationships and cosmic processes, the event became a lens through which the fundamental structures of existence within the lands between could be examined and understood in new ways. The psychological impact of preparing for combat against someone who had once been revered as a hero and protector created forms of internal conflict that challenged every participant's understanding of their own motivations and moral commitments, requiring individuals to confront questions about the relationship between personal loyalty and universal obligation that had no clear or simple answers. The festival demanded not only martial skill but spiritual courage, sufficient to accept responsibility for actions whose consequences would extend across generations and dimensional boundaries. The anticipation that built throughout the lands between as news of the festival spread created cultural phenomena that transcended normal categories of entertainment or political event. As communities that had been isolated by the shattering's aftermath found themselves united in contemplation of questions that affected everyone, regardless of their immediate circumstances or personal allegiances. The festival became a focal point for collective reflection upon themes that connected individual experience to cosmic processes operating beyond normal comprehension. Yet beneath all the philosophical complexity and ritual preparation lay the simple human reality of grief and love that motivated Geren's devotion to his transformed lord. Emotions that transcended theoretical considerations to create moral imperatives that demanded expression through whatever means, circumstance, and honor might permit. The festival represented not merely an intellectual exercise or strategic necessity, but an act of profound personal devotion that sought to honor bonds of affection and loyalty that could survive even the most fundamental alterations in consciousness and identity. The approaching culmination of these extensive preparations carried within it the promise of resolution that could address not only Radahn's immediate condition but the broader questions about cosmic responsibility and individual agency that his transformation had raised throughout the lands between. The festival would test whether mortal wisdom and divine power could cooperate in creating meaningful solutions to problems that operated on scales beyond normal understanding, establishing precedents that would influence how future generations approach similar challenges involving the intersection of personal relationship and universal duty. The moment of Radahn's death sent shockwaves through the very fabric of reality that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, where his transformed body finally succumbed to the combined efforts of the festival warriors, as the gravitational bonds that had held countless celestial bodies frozen in their positions for so many years suddenly released their accumulated tension in ways that challenged the fundamental stability of local space-time itself. The stellar configurations that he had maintained through corrupted will and cosmic responsibility began to resume their natural movements with a violence that reflected the enormous energies that had been contained within his failing consciousness, creating cascading effects that would reshape the relationship between terrestrial events and universal forces throughout the lands between and beyond. The stars themselves, freed from the artificial constraints that had held them motionless across vast distances of space, began to move with accelerated velocity that suggested not merely the resumption of natural orbital mechanics, but the discharge of potential energy that had been building within their frozen forms throughout the entire period of Radahn's stellar vigil. The mathematical relationships that governed their movements incorporated variables that reflected both their original trajectories and the modifications that corruption and cosmic responsibility had introduced into their fundamental nature, creating new patterns of celestial influence that operated according to principles beyond normal astronomical understanding. The immediate effects of this stellar liberation manifested throughout the lands between as gravitational disturbances that altered the apparent weight of objects, the flow of water, and the behavior of atmospheric phenomena in ways that suggested fundamental changes in the relationship between terrestrial gravity and cosmic forces, operating on scales that encompassed entire stellar regions. The carefully balanced systems that had relied upon Radahn's gravitational control for stability found themselves subjected to influences that demanded rapid adaptation or faced the prospect of catastrophic failure under conditions that no earthly engineering had been designed to accommodate. The falling star that created the massive crater near Limgrave represented perhaps the most dramatic and immediately visible consequence of the stellar liberation that followed Radahn's death. As one of the celestial bodies that had been held in artificial stasis suddenly found itself free to complete a trajectory that had been interrupted at the moment of its initial capture by gravitational forces operating beyond normal, astronomical processes. The meteor that struck the Earth carried within its crystalline structure energies and materials that reflected both its cosmic origin and the transformative influences it had absorbed during its period of forced immobility. The impact site that this falling star created became a focal point for cosmic energies that operated according to principles borrowed from multiple dimensional frameworks, creating conditions where the normal boundaries between terrestrial and stellar influences became permeable to forms of interaction that had never before been possible within the mortal realm. The crater served simultaneously as wound in the Earth's surface and window into cosmic processes that connected local events to universal forces operating on scales that challenged normal comprehension of cause and effect relationships. The geological surveys that were eventually conducted at the impact site revealed materials and energy patterns that incorporated elements of both normal stellar composition and the alien mathematics that had influenced Radahn's gravitational control, creating hybrid substances that possessed properties beyond conventional understanding of matter and energy. These discoveries provided unprecedented opportunities for studying the interaction between cosmic forces and terrestrial processes, while simultaneously raising disturbing questions about the stability of reality itself under conditions where such interactions became possible. The connections between this stellar impact and the broader phenomenon of malformed stars that had begun to manifest throughout the lands, between suggested systematic alterations in cosmic order that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of releasing individual celestial bodies from Seek, artificial constraint, Astel, and other entities whose existence challenged normal categories of stellar classification, represented forms of consciousness and cosmic influence that had emerged from the intersection of natural stellar development and the alien, forces that had shaped reality during the period of artificial stasis. These malformed stars embodied characteristics that reflected both their cosmic origin and the transformative influences they had absorbed through exposure to gravitational fields that operated according to principles beyond normal astrophysical understanding, creating hybrid entities whose consciousness spanned individual awareness and universal processes while maintaining enough coherence to function as active participants in cosmic events. Their presence throughout the transformed landscape served as evidence that Radahn's intervention in stellar mechanics had created conditions for forms of existence that transcended normal boundaries between consciousness and cosmic force. The relationship between these stellar entities and the punishment that had been inflicted upon the eternal cities in ages past revealed connections between different scales of cosmic justice that operated according to principles beyond normal understanding of cause and effect, crime and consequence. The artificial stars that the underground civilizations had attempted to create had violated cosmic law in ways that demanded correction through forces operating on scales that encompassed entire stellar regions. Yet the methods used to implement such correction had created precedents and possibilities that continued to influence cosmic development long after the immediate transgression had been addressed. The liberation of natural stellar movement that followed Radahn's death created opportunities for these cosmic forces to complete processes that had been interrupted by artificial intervention, allowing forms of justice and cosmic balance to manifest through mechanisms that transcended normal categories of punishment and redemption. The eternal cities found themselves confronting consequences that reflected both their original transgression and the accumulated effects of cosmic forces that had been building toward resolution across geological timescales. The theoretical implications of these cosmic changes for the fundamental structure of reality within the lands between demanded new frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual consciousness and universal forces that could accommodate interactions operating across multiple scales of space and time simultaneously. The death of a single being, regardless of their cosmic responsibilities, should not have been capable of reshaping stellar mechanics on such a comprehensive scale unless the connections between individual identity and cosmic processes operated according to principles that transcended normal categories of personal influence and universal law. The mathematical models that scholars developed to explain these phenomena incorporated variables that reflected both conventional astrophysical relationships and the alien mathematics that had influenced reality during the period of artificial stasis, creating hybrid theoretical frameworks that could accommodate observations while simultaneously revealing the inadequacy of existing knowledge for comprehending cosmic processes that operated beyond normal understanding. These models suggested that reality itself possessed forms of flexibility and responsiveness that allowed it to adapt to conscious intervention while maintaining essential structural integrity. The immediate practical consequences of stellar liberation extended throughout every aspect of life within the lands. Between as gravitational relationships that had remained stable for years suddenly became variable and unpredictable, requiring adaptation from communities that had organized their activities around assumptions about weight, trajectory, and physical interaction that no longer reflected actual conditions. The agricultural techniques that had been developed to work within Radahn's gravitational influence required modification to accommodate natural gravitational relationships, while transportation methods that had relied upon predictable trajectories found themselves challenged by cosmic forces that operated according to restored stellar mechanics. The effects upon different factions throughout the realm reflected their varying degrees of dependence upon cosmic stability and their ability to adapt to conditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between terrestrial events and universal forces. The Golden Order, with its emphasis on eternal hierarchy and unchanging divine law, struggled more than other groups to accommodate changes that suggested fluid and responsive relationships between consciousness and cosmic processes, while traditions that viewed existence as cyclical transformation found in the stellar liberation confirmation of philosophical principles that had guided their understanding across generations. Rani's quest progression, which had been dependent upon specific stellar configurations that could only manifest after the liberation of natural celestial movement, suddenly found itself able to advance toward objectives that had been impossible to achieve, while Radahn maintained his artificial control over cosmic processes. The lunar forces that had shaped her destiny operated according to principles that required free interaction between stellar influences and terrestrial consciousness, creating conditions where her transformation into her intended cosmic role could finally begin to manifest according to the original design that had guided her choices and sacrifices. The connection between stellar movement and the fate of divine beings throughout the lands, between revealed patterns of cosmic law that operated beyond normal understanding of individual agency and universal constraint, suggesting that the destinies of all conscious entities were interconnected through gravitational relationships that reflected both personal choices and cosmic necessity. The liberation of stellar movement created opportunities for these interconnected destinies to resume their natural development, while simultaneously introducing new variables that would influence their ultimate resolution in ways that no previous cosmic cycle had experienced. The balance between order and chaos that emerged from these cosmic changes reflected the fundamental tension between stability and transformation that had always characterized existence within the lands between. Yet, the scale and complexity of the alterations created by stellar liberation introduced elements that challenged every existing framework for understanding how such balance could be maintained across multiple scales of reality. Simultaneously, the cosmic order that emerged from Radahn's death incorporated both the restoration of natural processes and the preservation of innovations that his intervention had introduced, creating hybrid systems that operated according to principles beyond normal categories of natural and artificial influence. The interpretations that different cultural and philosophical traditions brought to these cosmic changes revealed the diversity of frameworks that conscious beings used to make sense of events that operated beyond normal comprehension. As communities throughout the lands, between developed explanatory narratives that reflected their particular understanding of the relationship between individual choice and universal consequence. Some viewed the stellar liberation as restoration of natural order that had been disrupted by illegitimate intervention, while others interpreted it as evidence that reality itself possessed consciousness and was sufficient to respond to the needs and sacrifices of individual beings. The long-term implications of these cosmic alterations for the development of consciousness and civilization throughout the lands, between suggested possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of restored stellar movement, as the new relationship between terrestrial events and cosmic forces created opportunities for forms of interaction and development that had never before been possible within the mortal realm. The freed stars carried within their renewed movement potential influences and energies that could reshape not only physical processes but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, creating conditions where individual awareness and cosmic perspective could achieve new forms of integration and mutual enhancement. Yet beneath all the theoretical complexity and cosmic significance of these changes lay the simple human reality of loss and transformation that marked the end of an era defined by one being's willingness to sacrifice individual freedom for universal responsibility, a cosmic vigil that had preserved stability at enormous personal cost while creating conditions that made possible the very liberation that his death had achieved. The stellar movements that resumed their ancient dance across the heavens carried within their renewed freedom both tribute to his sacrifice and promise of transformations that would honor the cosmic trust he had maintained through corrupted will and divine purpose. The night sky above the lands between, freed from the artificial constraints that had held it motionless for so long, began once again to tell the stories that stellar movement had always written across the darkness, narratives of cosmic relationship and universal law that connected individual experience to forces operating on scales that encompassed the entire universe. Yet these renewed stories incorporated elements and influences that reflected the unique period of artificial stasis, creating new myths and possibilities that would guide the development of consciousness and civilization across ages yet to come, ensuring that Radahn's cosmic sacrifice would continue to influence the relationship between mortal choice and universal consequence long after his individual identity had merged with the stellar forces he had devoted his existence to, serving and protecting. So ends our contemplation of the Star Scourge, a tale that echoes across the cosmos like gravitational waves through time itself. We have witnessed how the mightiest can fall not through weakness, but through the very strength that defined them, how love for family, for duty, for the stars themselves can become the instrument of greatest tragedy. Radahn's story reminds us that even gods must reckon with forces beyond their control, that holding back fate itself demands a price that few could pay. In his madness, in his corruption, in the festival that celebrated his end, we see reflections of our own struggles, with forces that shape us beyond our understanding. The stars move once more above the lands between, carrying with them the dreams and nightmares that Radahn held in check through will alone. His legacy lives not only in the crater his body created, or the rot that still blooms in Caelid, but in the cosmic balance he maintained until his final breath. The faithful Leonard remains, a testament to bonds that transcend transformation and corruption, love that endures beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension. Rest now, knowing that even the greatest falls can serve purposes we cannot fathom, and that honor can persist even when consciousness fails. In the dance of stars restored to freedom, in the scarlet beauty born from sacrifice, we find the eternal truth that all things are connected across the vast tapestry of existence, bound together by forces stronger than gravity itself.